of this magnitude, but another terrorist attack was possible. So what kind of game plan was put in place?
Well, there's tremendous reliance on intelligence gathering. Certainly the FBI and CIA work more closely now than ever in communicating with each other and gathering information with the NSA. The FBI has set up counterterrorism task forces throughout the country. There's now, I believe, 23 of them. New York City was the first. And indeed, that was the entity that did the investigation of the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. There's a lot more awareness now than there was in 1993, quite frankly, but obviously didn't prevent a terrible tragedy like this.
All right. Well, Ray Kelly, former New York Police Commissioner. Mr. Kelly, thanks very much for talking with us this morning. We're going to go now to Washington, to Campbell Brown, who is across the street from the White House, which, as we mentioned, has been evacuated. Campbell, what's the latest?
Well, Katie, we're not actually sure at the moment if where exactly the president is right now. He was in Florida this morning. We understand that he was told about the situation while he was in a holding room at the Booker Elementary School, where he was scheduled to do a reading event. He was was informed by his National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, by telephone while he was in that holding room of the first incident when the first plane crashed into the World Trade Center. He was actually reading to children when he heard about the second incident, and that was from Andy Card, his chief of staff, who whispered in the president's ear while he was reading to children. We are told by White House officials that he is planning to convene a national security meeting of all of his top advisors. We do know that National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice and other key officials are now meeting in the Situation Room at the White House. As we mentioned, the rest of the White House has been evacuated. Only key personnel are allowed there. That meeting began about 9:39, we're told, this morning. Everyone else again evacuated. One of the questions, Katie, that we're asking right now, given that no one's been informed where the president is, and this is, of course, deliberate, is whether or not the White House will decide to put him on the so-called doomsday plane. This is a special plane designed for the president in the event of a nuclear attack, and it's far more sophisticated than Air Force One. It has the absolute most advanced electronics, equipment on board. He's able to communicate with anyone at any time and able to command the armed forces from this plane. They're able to refuel it mid-air, and they could essentially keep the president on this plane for an extended period of time. We don't know if that's an option that has been considered or something that they are looking at trying to do right now, or whether or not his plan is to come back here to the White House. The situation where we are now, though, it's fairly desolate because of the evacuation. They've actually pushed the White House staff, evacuated many of the buildings around here, and kept people several blocks away. We're at a hotel just about a block away where we do have a view, but again, only key personnel allowed in the White House at this time. Katie?
All right, Campbell Brown. Campbell, thank you very much for that update, and please keep us posted as things develop there.
Katie, joining us on the phone now is the governor of the state of New York, George Pataki. Governor, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Obviously, we're looking at some just devastating pictures of Lower Manhattan, similar pictures at the Pentagon in Washington, and another incident in Pittsburgh. Just first of all, your reaction.
Well, it's just a horrible, horrible day. It's an attack upon America, an attack upon New York, and we have statewide fire and emergency.
And then from Kabul itself, the capital of Afghanistan, a spokesman for the rulers there said that the Saudi dissidents, Osama bin Laden is a Saudi Arabian citizen, could not be responsible for a spate of terror attacks in the United States. I don't understand that particularly, but here's the quote from him. It says, "What happened in the United States was not a job of ordinary people. It could have been the work of governments. Osama bin Laden cannot do this work, neither us," said the Taliban spokesman to the Reuters news agency in Kandahar, which is a city in the southern part of Afghanistan. This could have been the act of either internal enemies of the United States or its major rivals. Now, there are a couple of things. John Miller talked to me about this because you've been to Afghanistan. You went to see Osama bin Laden. In every organization, anywhere in the world where governments or organizations have been somehow connected to terrorism in the United States mind, real or not, people are just waiting. There's going to be some kind of response to this. When Osama bin Laden blew up those embassies, I guess it was before you went into Afghanistan, they attacked his camps. They didn't get him.
They sent 75 cruise missiles at $1 million apiece into his camps based on intelligence that he would be meeting there with his leadership.
Right.
He was not there, and they didn't get him. They destroyed his camps. I think that at the time or point that the government and the Bush administration identifies, not to the standard, and this is the way they've been working, not to the standard you would need to prove in court, but to the satisfaction of the administration that they know who's responsible. They will not deal with this as a criminal matter first, but as a military one first, and retaliate against someone somewhere. Too early to say who. One of the things about bin Laden that is so misunderstood, and his name has come up a few times today, is how he actually operates. More so than launching these operations himself at his direction from his own organization, and there are instances where he's charged with doing exactly that. In many more of the cases, especially of operations they shut down, the U.S. government takes the position that he's basically a foundation, that any terrorist group can approach him and say, we want to go to work. He'll provide the training, the financing, and then send them off to do their work, essentially with grant money, seed money, training, logistical support. So it doesn't necessarily have to be him to have his fingerprints on it.
Fires are still burning in the Pentagon, no surprise there. As John McCrethie and Barbara Starr both reported for us, this building penetrated the outer ring of the Pentagon and set many offices on fire on a variety of levels, and there are about 6 or 7 stories. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stories anyway in the Pentagon today. In at least one section they are alight. And as I said a couple of times, the Palestinian President Yasser Arafat, who's deeply engaged in a war now with the Israeli government, has also reacted very quickly to this today to express, to be perfectly honest, I haven't heard what he said, but so let's hear what he said now. This is Palestinian President Yasser Arafat.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Now, that's the Palestinian President, Chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, who, as I think everybody who watches the news or reads the news these days understands, is in a very, very bitter war with the Israelis, and in which terrorism has been a factor. Palestinians see what the Israelis do to them as terrorism, and certainly the Israelis and much of the world see the Palestinian and other suicide bombers who've attacked inside Israel to be terrorism of the most gruesome order, no question about that. And so we should not be surprised, as on previous circumstances, to see Chairman Arafat expressing his condolences, but other Palestinians who believe the United States is responsible for what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, or at least complicit and is certainly supplying the Israelis arms, will be happy to see this attack on the United States today. So take a look at a scene from Jerusalem not too long ago, in which there is some celebration that the powerful United States has been harmed, has been seen to be vulnerable, has been hurt, I suppose, in the broadest sense of the word. And the people who go off to do this sort of thing, both in the Middle East now, you must remember that a vast majority of the population of the Middle East now, in all countries, is under 21, much of it under 15, certainly under 17, and the kind of tensity and intention, if one presumes this terrorism, one shouldn't, this terrorism has had its genesis or had its roots somewhere in the Middle East, or at least in people who are opposed, are just brimming with anger at the United States. And we are now becoming more experienced with the notion that there are young men, for the most part, who are prepared to blow themselves up along with everybody else in terms, if they can be a service to the cause. And they believe they believe, as do some people believe about Islam, that they will, by sacrificing themselves, go on to another place. It's an unfair comment on Islam in some respects, but it is certainly a motivating factor, that the hatred of the United States, and the hatred of the United States is a patron of Israel. Whether you're from Afghanistan, or whether you're from Iran, Iraq, or inside the Palestinian territories, is so intense at some levels, and has become more intense in recent months, that a great many people will not be surprised at this attack today, though, like everybody else, will be amazed at the magnitude and success of it. John McCarthy at the Pentagon. John.
Peter, we are standing outside the Pentagon at this point. It has been already a long morning for rescue workers and police here. One eyewitness I talked to, who was on this busy highway outside the Pentagon this morning, said he saw an airplane coming directly over his head. It was an American Airlines plane. He could see the number on the plane. He could almost see the passengers inside as it went along the highway, started clipping off the high wires and the different light poles along the highway, and slammed directly into the side of the Pentagon. As we said earlier, Peter, the aircraft penetrated deep inside the Pentagon. It is organized in rings from the E ring on the outside. It penetrated all the way into the A ring in the inner part of the Pentagon. After it burned for a number of minutes, a part of the building collapsed. By the time rescue workers could get in there, the destruction was just terrific.
John, do you have any sense of the casualties?
We don't have any sense, Peter, except the size of the medical operation that has been set up here is enormous. They are anticipating the casualties. Certainly the injured will be in the hundreds. I certainly don't want to speculate on those killed.
And John, it's a little hard to get a sense of the size sometimes for the picture. Can you describe, maybe in feet or in yards, how big a penetration this is?
The roof has collapsed, Peter. There is a chasm in the side of the Pentagon that is probably 200 or 300 feet across. From the roof of the Pentagon, there is this huge V shape that has collapsed. You can see deep inside the Pentagon from the street now.
This is into the inner courtyard of the Pentagon itself.
It's into the innermost ring of the Pentagon, Peter. I have not been able to get into the courtyard, but I was told that the penetration was all the way into the deepest ring of the Pentagon.
And John, the office building, the Pentagon is about, what, 6 stories high?
It's 5 stories above ground, Peter, and several stories below. Clearly the damage is primarily above ground, but also some of those in the lower offices. I was sitting in the Pentagon when the attack happened. I was on the opposite side of the building. It shook the entire building. It was very clear that something terrible had happened. There was chaos immediately after the attack, Peter. Secretary of Defense, I walked out with the Deputy Secretary of Defense. The Marine Corps Commandant couldn't get out the door because security had locked it. It was chaos.
Okay, John, and the fires are still burning at the moment, we believe?
They are still burning. They are mostly oil fires, it appears, Peter. The fire hoses have been on the various fires for the last several hours, so they're beginning to put them out, but obviously there is still heavy gray smoke coming out of that portion of the Pentagon that was so terribly damaged.
John, there are a couple of aircraft at least around the country today which are still unaccounted for. You gave a very clear description earlier of how this aircraft had approached the Pentagon, but did anybody able to identify it as an aircraft associated with an airline?
Absolutely, Peter. The eyewitness I talked to looked up and said it was an American Airlines plane. I saw it clear as could be. It went right over the top of my car and clipped a pole right in front of where my car was.
Thank you very much, John McCarthy. I actually think that you may have said that earlier, and I simply lost it in terms, just lost it. And so we now know that it was, from at least one eyewitness there, it was an American Airlines aircraft which crashed into the Pentagon. So let me just try to get some grasp on the airplane. We have 2 United flights, a 757 which was on its way from New York to San Francisco, which crashed near Pittsburgh. We have a United flight which crashed from Boston to Los Angeles, United 175, and we do not know where that aircraft has crashed or been crashed as of now. And we have these 2 American flights, one from Boston to Los Angeles, which is a 767 with 81 passengers and 11 crew on board, talking about almost 100 people on American Flight 11. And American Flight 77, which was scheduled from Washington to Los Angeles, with 58 passengers and 6 crew members on board. And John Miller and I sitting here looking at each other about where these flights were going. And there's several ways to speculate about it, but you came up with one very interesting on already.
From a forensic standpoint, if you look operationally to crash these flights, it would have been just as simple to get on the Washington shuttle or the New York shuttle and crash one into the Trade Center and the other in the Pentagon. The choice of flights here, Newark to San Francisco, Boston to L.A., Dulles to L.A.
Excuse me, John, I apologize. Let me come back just because we have the New York governor here.
Sure.
Governor George Pataki, the governor of New York, I believe, is on the telephone or somewhere. Governor Pataki, do you hear me?
Yes, Peter, I hear you fine.
Well, why don't you first start off, sir, and give us your appraisal of the day so far.
Well, it's just a horrific scene, and everybody's pulling together. We're activating the state emergency forces, but our hearts and prayers are with the victims and the families of those victims, and we have to, at this point, just focus on trying to help as many people whose lives are at risk as possible and dealing with those who have been injured.
Do you have some sense of the magnitude of casualties?
We don't want to quantify a number, but obviously it's a horrific incident that really is just an incredible outrage against the people of New York and the people of America. But at this point, our focus is on trying to make sure that those whose lives are still at risk are as protected, and those who have been injured are treated as quickly and as well as possible.
Governor, do you believe that thousands of people have been killed?
I don't want to use a number, Peter. At this point, the goal is simply to try to help as many people as possible. We're working closely with the city, with our National Guard forces coming in to help relieve the city police and fire. Obviously, it's a situation that just cries out for people to be horrified, and but what we have to do at this point is focus on helping those who are at risk, helping those who have been injured, making sure there's an orderly removal from Lower Manhattan, and that is our focus at this point.
Governor, are you in a position to go to the scene? Are you in a position to go to Lower Manhattan? Do you think you should? Would you like to, or are you locked down?
No, I'm in the city, but the important thing is to be able to stay in contact with the White House, with City Hall, with our statewide emergency services. We've gotten offers of support from all the surrounding states with their emergency services, and the critical thing right now is to be able to coordinate to make sure that the response is the strongest and the most compassionate it can be for the people whose lives are still at risk. And we're mobilizing National Guard units from across the state. We're getting help from the surrounding states and coordinating with the city, and that's what we have to do at this point.
Governor, what have you done about the other so-called high-profile potential targets in New York City, like the UN and the bridges and things like this? Are they all evacuated and locked down now?
UN's evacuated. The tunnels have been closed. The George Washington Bridge is open under security for emergency services coming in and people going out. We've shut down most of the mass transit. Grand Central is open under very tight security, but people who pass through the security have limited service to the northern suburbs, and we're doing the same thing on Long Island. But the important thing now is to provide as much help as quickly and as effectively to those whose lives are at risk or those who've been injured, and we're working with the city and the federal officials to make sure that happens.
Do you believe that New York City is now under control?
New York City has been under attack, and until we get through this, we just have to continue to respond as strongly as we can.
And are you in a profile now? Are you in a position where you actually think there's a potential for more?
We just don't know. That's why we have to not only help those who have been injured, but also take every security step we can to try to prevent further incidents. We just don't know, Peter.
Okay. Governor Pataki, thank you very much. Governor George Pataki of New York, who is in New York City, which, of course, is where he probably belongs at a moment like this. Downtown Manhattan is saying simply that the National Guard has been called in, the tunnels are closed, the George Washington Bridge, which is across which goes across the Hudson River from the west side of Manhattan into New Jersey. Just remember, a large segment of many thousands of people from New Jersey work in New York, and there's tremendous commerce back and forth on a daily basis. That has all been brought to a help. It's interesting to recall, John Miller, that the attack on the trade towers in '93 was launched from New Jersey, or at least the operational headquarters of the people who attacked the Trade Center were in New Jersey.
Correct. And the building of the bomb and the original conspiracy was all carried out in towns right across the river. In fact, the conspirators later admitted that they watched from New Jersey to see if the buildings would in fact fall, and they didn't. This time they did.
They did today. And Governor Pataki, trying, as politicians again must on occasions like this, trying to express the horror and the commitment that the political establishment feels to those people who have died and those people who need to be rescued. It's an answer to every question about whether or not something was locked down or something. He came back every time that their priority now is to try to help those people who are in deep and, in some cases, still desperate trouble. George Stephanopoulos, one of our senior reporters, is downtown. Hey, George, where have you been? What have you seen? What do you think?
Well, Peter, I'm going to give you kind of a pool report from several of our correspondents down here of basically what happened down here in downtown New York between 9:45 and 10:45 when the two explosions and the collapse of the World Trade Center happened. At the time, I was actually in the subway heading towards the World Trade Center right around Franklin Street, and after the first explosion, the subway station started to fill with smoke. The subway cars started to fill with smoke, and the subways actually stopped. They then diverted us around the World Trade Center to Park Place, which is one stop beyond the World Trade Center. We got to that train station at around 10:35, Peter, and it was a scene unlike I've ever seen before in my entire life. As we tried to get out of the subway station and walk up into the street, it was pitch black, midnight black, snowing soot all down through downtown Manhattan. This was about 2 blocks from the World Trade Center. You couldn't see a foot in front of your face at that time. We then worked our way back uptown. All of the firefighters and police officials and National Guard are now evacuating everyone out of lower Manhattan. They're going east towards Brooklyn and north, which is where we are now, up on Canal Street. I should add as well, Peter, we had one of our reporters was downtown and had a sight line of the World Trade Center at around 9:48, which is around the time I believe the first tower collapsed, Gloria Rivera, and she saw 2, then 3, then 4 people jump out of the top floors of the World Trade Center. She was with a firefighter who said they're not falling, they're jumping, watch their arms waving, and they counted 12 people jump off the top floors.
Do you want to continue, George?
Well, right now, as I said, they are evacuating everyone else out. But just to give you another sense, Peter, all over lower Manhattan, the sidewalks, the streets are covered with about 1/4 to 1/2 inch of dust, of soot, as if it were Pompeii. Most people are pretty calm right now. They're evacuating slowly as the firefighters come in. But it really was one of the most frightening, horrific scenes I've ever seen in my life.
Thanks, George, very much. Come back anytime with a report. As you were concluding there, watching these guys go up that escalator, and if it's in the World Trade Center, we know that their cameraman got out, but we don't know about anybody else because, within an hour and something of the time these 2 attacks had occurred, these 2 buildings had completely disappeared, and you begin increasingly to see more dramatic footage. George Stephanopoulos made a reference to Pompeii near Naples on the west coast of Italy, which was, buried by a volcano, and you get exactly that same sense of freezing stuff in soot and dirt, as might have occurred by a volcano. Jim Kellstrom, with whom we're long familiar, former official of the FBI in the New York office, is on the air, very deeply involved in the Flight TWA 800 investigation. Jim, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
What do you think?
Peter?
I'm listening, Jim. I
Yes.
just say, what do you think? I mean, just start and I'll...
Well, my first thought is with the tremendous casualties, and the death toll is just overwhelming. It's a day that 50 years from now, our children, if we're still teaching history, will be taught about when we went to war on American soil with terrorism.
Jim, if you had a chance to talk to your more active colleagues in the FBI at the moment about what they're doing at the moment, whether they're able to, I mean, it seems the hardest thing at the moment is to make an appraisal of all this. It just happened, and it's just, in some respects, it's happened and it's happening, right?
Peter, you're right. I mean, it happened. It's shocking, but in some ways it isn't shocking. I mean, we've had, the hatred of America played out at the Trade Center in '93. They tried to take the Trade Center down. We've had the hatred played out in the USS Cole, the bombings of our embassies in Africa, the bombings of the barracks in Saudi Arabia. So Now it's being played out big time here in the United States.
Jim, what is the principal goal of the FBI at a moment like this, when all of the emergency services are brought to bear in all of these locations? What's the FBI actually doing at the moment?
I think the first concern of the FBI right now, right this second, is there going to be something else happening in the next 5 minutes, 30 minutes, hour, 12 hours? Simultaneous with that, who did it? Where are they? What do we know? What's the intelligence base? Tell us. Why didn't we see this coming? Where do we go from here? What kind of articulate, defined information can we give the National Command Authority so that we can bring the necessary massive retaliation necessary without a lot of collateral damage?
Well, Jim, thank you very much for checking in with us, and please do at any time if you have news. That photo, as Jim was talking, Jim Kallstrom, the former director of the FBI here, and a major force in the investigation of TWA 800, which blew up off the south coast of Long Island.
And the principal operator in the first World Trade Center bombing. Key investigator.
Right. But it's interesting, forgive me, no offense intended him, he doesn't have much to say either today, because in some respects there isn't much to say except the horror of it. But as we were looking at just a moment ago, listening to George Stephanopoulos talking to our reporters who witnessed the horrifying jump of some people from the top of the trade towers, you just saw a hint of the just ahead of this little piece of video here before, you saw a hint of what people were enduring at the top of the trade towers before they collapsed as a result of the intensity of the fire. And we've seen it before in other places around the world. Fire starts in a place, people often, ironically, not that it would have made any difference today, do the wrong thing, they get trapped in an open window by fire coming into their room, and finally they just jump, simply because if they don't jump, they're probably going to be burned alive. But as we have heard from, it's interesting that Governor Pataki is so nervous, and I don't blame him for a second, wanting to stay away from the magnitude of the casualties here today. But as John McKenzie reported from the fire department downtown, we got 200 fire department officials, 200 firefighters missing. I don't know whether or not this is a firefighter who's been brought, but you see in every case people getting oxygen because it isn't collapse. If it isn't collapse that kills in some cases like this, it is the deadly smoke. Anybody who's been involved in a fire knows the deadly smoke which suffocates people in a circumstance like this. But we are only getting touches, and it doesn't even have the chaos associated with it in many cases. We're just getting touches now of what has happened in these variety of places. The Pentagon are being kept, quite logically, I think, back at some distance. And in downtown, what's happened is that camera crews were downtown. I fear, to be perfectly honest, for some of the camera crews who work nothing braver than a cameraman either, who goes right in when something has happened and may indeed have been at some of those places. And it certainly takes time for video to get back from a location like this so that we get a widening appreciation of what has happened. But as I said, it's very hard to try to get some grasp now on the number of casualties. So we can do, in some cases, not more than just tell you how this is in terms of the whole country. The North American Air Defense Command, NORAD, is on the highest state of alert. And you had us made references earlier in the morning how the United States and Canada have cooperated in trying to keep the airports locked down, lest there was another aircraft on the air. But John, talk to me about this for a second, and then we'll come to this business about fuel. Sure. You know, the North American Air Defense Command was a great factor in our lives in the 1960s.
In the Cold War,
exactly.
Yes.
During the Cold War, it's up along the Northwest Territories and some of the independent areas of the North. Nobody thinks about it anymore, and here it is on a state of alert today.
No, but you factor that in, and evincing so many images that Americans are uncomfortable with. The idea that there's a no-fly zone in New York City, in Manhattan, being patrolled by F-16s with instructions to shoot down any errant aircraft, that the same is true in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. that military people and doctors and military vehicles are coming to aid, that the National Guard is on alert. You know, the kind of images that used to only exist in the fantasies of 7 days in May, where, you know, the Army would take to the streets, which has not happened yet. They've offered assistance and military logistical assistance, but that kind of thing that Americans are so uncomfortable with unfolding here.
And I realize, by the way, just as you something else is very important at the moment, and again, I don't mean to say this in melodramatic terms. Where is the President of the United States? The President of the United States led, I know we don't know where he is, but pretty soon the country needs to know where he is. And it seems to, I think, me anyway, I apologize, the President needs to talk to us. He left Florida a couple of hours ago. Our people in Washington are clearly listening and checking this as best they can. But one of the important factors at the moment is that the political leadership in the country be present, as Governor Pataki was. Mayor Giuliani of New York, you know, made an appearance on the street and was caught unawares like everybody else, but Governor Pataki came out and basically told the citizenry of New York in a variety of different ways, I assume, just exactly what they're trying to do. Now, here's a bulletin about the President's whereabouts. The President is about to make a statement at Barksdale Air Force Base shortly. Barksdale Air Force Base is in Louisiana. So, if this is accurate, and we'll check with Claire Shipman and our other reporters at the White House, and John Cochran, if he can, in Florida at the moment, who's with the President today. The President's not coming back to Washington at the moment. We'll leave that for just a second. We'll talk a little more about this business of the aircraft and the fuel. We're trying to figure out why would a plane going from Newark to San Francisco, Boston to Los Angeles be involved in this? It could have been any plane, though, right? It could have been, but when you consider the advantage to a terrorist, here you have a transnational flight. It's going to be a larger aircraft in each case, but, and this is the key, because we had speculated earlier, was there some additional explosives laden in these planes to cause these incredibly large explosions? It appears who's ever planned this has picked cross-country flights that would have the maximum amount of fuel you could carry on a domestic flight. Flights going from one end of the country to the other. The kind of jet that if you slammed into a building would ensure the maximum fire and explosion possible from any flight that you could have chosen. Again, Newark to San Francisco, Boston to LA, Dulles to Los Angeles, Washington to LA, Boston to LA. The planes that are being looked at in this attack today were apparently, or you could speculate, chosen to give the terrorists the very biggest bang for their effort. And it's a very interesting point you make, because again, our assumptions tend to go when we see huge explosions like this. None of us understanding visually the power of explosives, that there were explosives on board, and so you're quite right, it may indeed have been the aircraft explosion. I mean, John Nance could help us with this, but when you hear the amount of fuel, very flammable aeronautical fuel that's loaded onto a plane for a 3,000-mile trip or something, that's going to give you quite an explosion. Flight 800, which was an international flight, to those who saw it, was an incredible explosion. John, if you'd sit at your station for a second, I'm just going to go and try to check one piece of information, and in that period of time, we're going to try to give you a little better sense of the disaster at the trade towers today. Here's something we've compiled, and we compile it as we go along.
I was standing next to One World Trade Center, and then all of a sudden I heard rumbling, and we all started running away from it. The glass like blew out and threw me onto the sidewalk, and I couldn't see for like 20 seconds. And then I started seeing vaguely the street, and I just started walking, and my eyesight came back. I see you're bloody. You have dust all over you. Yeah, it was bad. It was like a dust storm or something. Like I couldn't see anything. How badly are you hurt? I have no idea.
As soon as he got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It's bad.
We just come out of Tower 1. We were walking towards Broadway. They're saying, move along, move along, move along. I looked up as soon as we got across the street. I looked up. I saw the tower start to buckle. I just turned and ran, ducked down, put a jacket over my head. 3 or 4 of us huddled together, and it was just black everywhere.
Were you covered? Were you hit with debris?
No. But I mean, I was ducked behind a subway cover, so I put with the jacket over. The 3 of us, all of us huddled together. There was, dust and whatnot everywhere, but it was.
everyone's being asked to get down. Come down.
Can't even look at it. Because all I can see are people. I don't see a building, I see people. People hurt. Children without mothers and fathers tonight.
If you're just joining us, you probably already know the World Trade Center towers, the Twin Towers, the New York landmarks have collapsed and are gone. The Pentagon has been hit by an airplane, a series of hijackings apparently today at the root of this. What we know is hundreds, if not thousands, are injured, no count on the deceased yet, and that the investigation, a massive investigation, is just beginning to unfold.
But John, I stepped aside there, among other things, the moment to try to get some sort of sense from people who talk to, because as soon as this happens, people begin to think about a response. We don't expect a response to come in the immediate future by any means, but I was just talking to Charlie Gibson from Good Morning America, and he'd been thinking about the same thing, that the response to this from the United States is going to have to be massive. They have to accomplish something in some way, because so much of the response to terrorism before by a large nation such as this, which is not impotent but very limited in its capacity to operate at this kind of level. You were mentioning earlier the attacks against Osama bin Laden's training camps in Afghanistan. In retrospect, they spent, as you pointed out, more than $1 million per cruise missile. I forgot how many they sent. They didn't get anything. They didn't get anything. They didn't do anything. So it's an enormous challenge for a powerful nation to respond in an effective way. And the Pentagon is still burning, and today the World Trade Center towers have gone. Diane Sawyer is down in Times Square at the moment, and among other things, I think has been trying to get some grasp of the number of casualties involved. It must be very difficult, Diane.
It's impossible, Peter, no matter how many people you call. And of course, no matter what the facts we get now, one can only imagine what the facts will be later. I want to give you a sense of what it's like here in Times Square right now, because if you look outside, we have hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of people standing outside, just stopping still, a kind of respectful witness, looking up at the screens where we're broadcasting the pictures. They can't hear the sound. They are simply looking at the wordless horror and standing to show, in a way, respect. And I want to show you something else, because people have been sent home from Times Square, and across the way, the construction workers who were building the Toys R Us building next door to us just hung their signs outside. God bless America, and pray for families and victims. And we can only, of course, add to that that as crisply as we try to report what's happening here today, we join them. And this is not just another story, even for reporters who've been trained to do this for so long. A few things to add since this morning. We were on the air, of course, live when suddenly we get word of that first explosion at the World Trade Center, the first building. And initially, of course, we didn't know if it was an accident. We didn't know what had happened. And then we were on the air live when the second plane came in and the second plane hit. And I want to show you now. This is what we were seeing live on the air. And as you've expressed before, Peter, the combination of disbelief and horror and simple prayer for somebody to save the people who were inside that building is all anybody can do, as an entire network is broadcasting live something so unimaginable. I have talked, as you all have, and as George Stephanopoulos reported, to the people who were inside as these scenes were taking place. We now see the first collapse, which of course took place about 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and then it would be about 28 minutes later that we would see the second collapse of the second building. And while we're watching the scene, each person desperate to stop this tape and go and do something. All we can do is relive the horror each time we see it. I have talked to people who are inside the building, one of them, Fran Martin, who is the aunt of someone who works here at ABC, and she was saying that the first experience inside the building was that earthquake-like feeling a number of people have mentioned, and then something else in an eerie, silent, kind of mournful foliage. You saw paper just wafting out in all directions, and it was so mysterious to everyone. They couldn't imagine what had happened. The paper was scattering, and we've now read some 3 miles out, way across the river, the paper from those floors. As they came down the stairs, we're told that people were remarkably calm, were remarkably respectful of each other as they were making their way down, even though a number of them had lived through that bombing 8 years ago. A number of them remembered what it was when the bomb went off in the basement of the World Trade Center. And of course, as we now know, if the cyanide gas had not vaporized in those bombs, that it would have been a cataclysm even beyond what was experienced then. So they could all relive it as they were making their way down. Now we're watching the scenes as the building is collapsing and people are running from it. People are covered with this kind of spectral suit from the building's collapse itself. I want to point out again, and you've talked about it too, Peter, all the firefighters were immediately called on duty. All the firefighters immediately raced in from wherever they were to help out, all the emergency medical service personnel. This was a great display of human concern and human consideration. And you've mentioned before, we have this report that 200 firefighters are now missing, and yet they have done everything they can. Every hospital is open, every hand is on deck, every doctor is standing by in the city of New York with all this courage and struggle and still heartbreak out there in the streets right now. So that's it from Times Square, Peter.
Thank you very much, Dan. I remember working with Diane on the Millennium broadcast on New Year's Eve 2000. Diane had such a joyful time in Times Square. It is, whatever you think of New York in general, it is a place where people from around the world gather to express themselves, and so we'll go back there on occasion to get some, you can really get some sense of the world in Times Square. And President Bush has been on the phone today to a variety of world leaders, clearly discussing this with them at the highest possible level. And perhaps they're all as confused as the rest of us are as to what has happened, who perpetrated these acts of terrorism in the United States, and what is to be done in response. Though this is perhaps, we're only 4 hours since this actually happened, and perhaps it is not quite the time to begin to think about the precision of a response, but a response will be required of some magnitude that will mean something from the United States if one is ever able to pin down exactly who the perpetrators were. We told you that the President was in Florida this morning, where he'd intended to talk about education today and was coming back to Washington. He's made it as far as Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where he landed about an hour and a bit ago, just before noon Eastern time, where he's made a statement to the cameras, which we haven't got our hands on yet. But the President said that freedom had been attacked, but freedom will be defended. And the President is in touch with his national security team. Ann Compton, ABC's Ann Compton, who covers the White House for us for many years from us, tells us that jet fighters accompanied Air Force One, and that as best we can tell, the Air Force One was flying at a particularly high altitude. There are no planes taking off or landing or taking off in the United States at the moment, with the exception of Air Force One, though the Federal Aviation Administration says at the moment that 50 known aircraft, this is actually a few minutes old, 50 known aircraft are all in the sky within approximately 50 miles of their destination. So you can feel across the country that aircraft that were in flight are beginning to settle down. They were ordered to settle down by the FAA and to land at the nearest possible airport. And so that has begun to work out. Now in Washington, I think Claire Shipman at the White House or near it has some further information about the President. Yes, Claire.
Well, that's right, Peter. Essentially, what we've learned is what he told the pool cameras a few minutes ago, and we're hopefully going to see in just a few minutes, but he said that the he and this government have taken steps to ensure the functioning of the United States government, that the U.S. military is on high alert at home and abroad. He said he has taken all appropriate security measures to protect Americans. He says freedom itself has been attacked and freedom will be protected. And finally, he also said he will hunt down and punish those responsible for this. Again, we're hoping to see him in person, but as you mentioned, it looks as though this may be the secure place that they've decided on for the president, at least temporarily, Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana.
I'd be really curious, Claire, and I realize how difficult it is at the moment, whether or not there's not pressure, political pressure in Washington from the members of the president's own staff and cabinet for him to show up soon in front of the country and assure them beyond his statement that freedom has been attacked and freedom will be defended, of course, because it wasn't defended this morning.
Well, I think
whether or not the president to be seen in command in a more vigorous way.
I think you're absolutely right, and I'm sure it's a delicate balance right now between the Secret Service and those who are trying to protect the president, keeping him out of sight and someplace secure, and his political advisors who would clearly like to see him make a statement. You saw how quickly he did it this morning, as brief as it was, and certainly a piece of tape that we're going to see in a few minutes, we hope, is not what they would like to see the president doing right now. They would like to see him making something of a more formal statement. But again, it could be a number of hours before the president is back in Washington and prepared to talk to us from that forum.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. We'll come back to you anytime you want. And again, none of us should be surprised at what's happening. First of all, Secret Service is a huge, powerful, authoritative organization which takes the president's safety and other members of the senior political leadership with deep and profound seriousness, but they have enormous power. And so if you're talking between a senior political official and the president's Secret Service official of equal stature at the moment, who's going to win that argument at the moment? And this is particularly true in a situation which continues to unfold, because while the devastation, perhaps the greatest devastation has occurred in New York City this morning, it's also occurred outside Washington at the Pentagon, and the tension is there all across the country, because not only were the United Nations and various government buildings evacuated here in New York City, but the Sears Tower in Chicago, the tallest skyscrapers in Boston and Cleveland and Minneapolis, and the Space Needle in Seattle. So the psychological effect on people in the country is huge. It may indeed be settling down after several hours, but the president and his response to this is also part of the psychological package, because the country looks to the president on occasions like this to be reassuring to the nation. Some presidents do it well, and some presidents don't. But ABC's Ann Compton is with the president at the moment, and we have her on the telephone. Annie.
Peter, it has been a frightening couple of hours for President Bush. We took off in Air Force One from Florida, where he first got word of this, and we literally, Peter, have been flying at well over 40,000 feet west, the White House unable to tell us where we were headed or how long it would take. There were jet fighters off the wing just out of our sight until we landed. And the president has spent the time on board the aircraft talking not only to world leaders but to the vice president, to his cabinet. He even checked in with Mrs. Bush, trying to get more information. We were high enough so that the Air Force was actually able to get some television signal. We don't know much about what's gone on the ground, but he has been able to see some of it on a very fuzzy television picture. We landed here at Barksdale Air Force Base. This is near Shreveport, Louisiana, at about 11:45 Eastern Time. We were not allowed to use cell phones or give you any indication of where we were until local people noticed the plane on the ground. The president has just made a statement, Peter, a very emotional one, saying that freedom has been attacked, but freedom will be defended, saying that America's military is on its highest state of alert. World leaders have been assured that the U.S. will do whatever it takes to protect America and Americans. Frankly, Peter, I thought the president not only looked grim, very solemn, but his eyes looked somewhat red.
Annie, let me ask you a couple of questions, if I may. First of all, the president was on a education trip, ostensibly, in Florida today. How much of the national security team was with him?
This is actually a skeleton team with him on a short, it was a trip that lasted only about 24 hours. He was just making his last appearance before returning to Washington. And Karl Rove, one of his senior counselors, is with him, and his press secretary, Ari Fleischer, but none of the national security apparatus such as Condoleezza Rice, who would ordinarily travel with the president on a more substantive trip. But on Air Force One, of course, he has the full resources of communications, but he does not have the full team with him.
Well, let's talk about this for a second, because when the president took off from Florida and went immediately to 40,000 feet, and I believe actually got a fighter escort for part of the way, it reminds one a little bit of what it was like in the Cold War, because the Cold War there was always a provision that the senior members of the government, president included, could in fact run the country from a command center in the sky. Is that basically what's happening this morning?
Absolutely. In fact, the U.S. used to have 5 aircraft, now Air Force One. Let me know if we're being taken out of here. We may be scrambled out of here.
Okay.
Are we leaving? Okay, Peter, we are leaving. And
where are you going, Annie?
Peter, I have no idea. They have not told us. They have kept us. We don't even know whether we'll be able to see the president or travel with him, but we are told that he's been traveling. He will continue. They are still quite worried about his own security.
Off you go, and Ann, thanks very much for a very, very full report on the state of, and perhaps even a little bit of the mental condition of the president at the moment. And we cannot state it often enough. The country looks to him, and so he may have stopped at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, which is just where Arkansas and Texas and Louisiana all come together at an Air Force base out of the way, and he may be safe at 40,000 feet in Air Force One, but before long the country is going to expect him to be back in Washington to send, if not only a message, not just a message to those of us in the nation who look to the president for some sense of political national stability, but also to the other parts of the world where these enemies of the United States, with whom we've talked quite a lot about today, at the moment must surely think they have the United States on the run to some extent. And while the Taliban, the political leadership, political, military, religious leadership in Afghanistan said this morning that they condemned this and had nothing to do with it, and it could not have been Osama bin Laden, because he wasn't sophisticated enough to do it. It had to be a country or a government, certainly. And while the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat, came out and put as much distance as they could between them and the Palestinian people, this active in the Palestinian people, the president needs to be on station to talk it. As does the mayor of New York, and Mayor Giuliani is with us at the moment. Mr. Mayor, can you hear me?
I can, Peter.
Mr. Mayor, I saw you several times on the street today, and it looked like you were deeply sharing the horror that all of us feel. But I'd really appreciate, aside from, on top of your sentiments about all this, give us some sense of what's going on.
What is going on now is a massive rescue effort. We have thousands of police officers and firefighters in lower Manhattan trying to rescue as many people as we possibly can. There are still a lot of people there that are injured, hurt, dazed, and we're trying to get them out, and we're mobilizing all of our fire, police, and emergency resources to do that. The governor has alerted the National Guard, and they're being deployed to come and relieve us early to later this afternoon. And the urban search and rescue teams are coming here from around the country to also assist us. But until then, which means until probably 2, 3, 4 o'clock this afternoon, our police department, our fire department, and our emergency people are being stretched to the limit. And I'm sure we've also lost a significant number of them.
Now, you're reluctant, I assume, to put any other name attached to the casualties except significant. Do you believe it's hundreds or thousands?
I really don't. I really don't want to say right now, Peter. I think it's going to be a horrible number. I saw people jumping out of the World Trade Center. I saw some of the firefighters who I know going into the building. And we were in a building in which we were trapped for about 10-15 minutes.
Are you talking about did you go immediately to the Office of Emergency Management?
No, I went down to the scene, and we set up headquarters at 75 Barclay Street, which was right there with the police commissioner, the fire commissioner, the head of emergency management. And we were operating out of there when we were told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse. And it did collapse before we could actually get out of the building. So we were trapped in the building for 10-15 minutes and finally found an exit and got out walk north and took a lot of people with us.
My question is, the Office of Emergency Management headquarters, into which you put enormous effort for coordination in a disaster like this, has it been damaged? Is it
yes.
still operating? It's gone?
It's been damaged. I don't know how badly. And right now, that whole area of Manhattan, including the police department, which is another area we would operate from, City Hall, is another area we would operate from, have been closed off. So we've moved to a secure location in Midtown Manhattan where we're operating city government.
Is it fair to say, do you think, that all of your drills for dealing with terrorism and disaster are going according to plan, or has this been of such of magnitude that we've just all been caught totally off balance?
Oh, there's no question we were all caught totally off balance. No one could possibly expect large airplanes to crash into the World Trade Center the way this happened. I think, having said that, as I watched what the police officers and the firefighters were doing, I think they're going to save the maximum number of lives you could possibly save in a situation like this. I mean, the emergency efforts that they've been going through over the last 2.5 hours are nothing short of inspiring.
And when the National Guard comes in to say, did you say to take over or offer some relief, what can the National Guard do that you cannot do at a city level?
Oh, at this point, what they can do is relieve men who are going to be exhausted physically and emotionally.
Now, just if you would, because I know how busy you are, just give us some sense of what you thought at the time about all this.
I thought that I would never live to see anything like this. I didn't think anything like this was possible. When I first arrived there, I rushed down there from Midtown Manhattan, and I saw the first building that had been crashed open. And when you look at it, it takes you a minute to really comprehend that this is actually happening. And to see people jumping from the top of the World Trade Center. I mean, I don't think I've ever had a nightmare that's worse than this.
Mr. Mayor, one last question. You said you never believed you'd live to see anything like this, and yet in the past you've been one of the leaders in preparing for just this
Absolutely.
Kind of thing to happen.
Yeah, but you keep you prepare for the worst, but you don't believe that it'll happen, and this is the worst. And I can only say that I thank God for the police department and the fire department that we have, because this would be much, much worse. And I'm also very proud of the people of the city. We evacuated Lower Manhattan with literally thousands of people, walked along with them, and they conducted themselves really, really, really well.
Well, I appreciate your time, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for communicating all this.
The Mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, in his last term, immensely popular with some, not popular with others, which is not relevant at the moment, but because he puts his finger on something about New York. Whatever you think of New York, no matter where you live in the country, this is a city which behaves pretty well in crisis. There's a public spirit here in this city. You see it in blackouts, you see it in snowstorms. This is not the city it's not the city that we often criticize from other perspectives around the country in times of crisis. So when the mayor says he's proud of the people of New York as well as the fire department and the police, one should not be surprised. But it is fascinating and terrifying to hear what he says. You prepare for the worst and you never believe it'll happen. And his emergency management headquarters right down there near the trade centers, which are no longer possible to operate, this is what they put into place so that in the worst of circumstances, government would have a place to operate. And they can't operate from there. They've had to move uptown because the police department and City Hall are not operable, if you will, under the circumstances. And he, the mayor, you heard it yourselves, said he never believed he would live to see anything like this. True of many people. George Stephanopoulos in downtown Manhattan with an eyewitness.
Yes, Peter, I'm here with Neil Stevens, who was in his apartment downtown early this morning getting ready for work as he heard the explosion. Neil, why don't you tell us what you saw?
Okay, I was in my apartment. I was getting ready for work. I heard a large explosion, and I thought at first it was thunder because there was thunder last night, but there was nice weather outside, so I didn't know what it could have been. And I looked outside, and I saw some construction workers who were working on the roof of the building next to mine. They were looking downtown. They were all looking downtown, and I thought, I wonder what they're looking at. So I looked over, and I could see the World Trade Center towers from my window. And I looked over, and I could see the tower, and there was a huge gash in the side of it. It's about 10 stories high, almost the full width of the building. And there was black smoke just billowing out of it, and flames, large flames. And I thought, my God, You know, I don't know what happened, but huge explosion, and personal telephone calls. Kept getting ready for work, and I was in the shower, and I heard the second explosion, and that's pretty much what I saw.
Emil, thank you very much. Peter, we also have some news on the evacuations. We've spoken with 2 security guards in the second tower who did say the evacuations of the second tower had begun. And we've also spoken with people who were on the 82nd and the 86th floor. So many people were evacuated. Of course, we don't have any sorts of numbers. One final note, Peter, I was picking up on what Mayor Giuliani was saying about the work of the firemen and the policemen. I would also add a word for the transit authority. The subways were terrifying earlier this morning, but all of the employees of the transit authority did a terrific job of evacuating the subways, even though they were filled with smoke, keeping people calm and keeping them actually in the station so that they wouldn't go out into the street as the soot was falling. One other word, Peter. Right now, the people who are working downtown are handing out these respirators because there is some concern that the buildings, that there was a great deal of asbestos in the building. So they're asking everyone downtown who is walking downtown, if they're down there, to put on these respirators, and they're handing them out on the corners.
Thank you very much, George Stephanopoulos, who continue to work this story from as close as you can get to the disaster area. But imagine a city that's sort of frozen in place. You saw a picture just a moment ago of the George Washington Bridge, which is closed except under very serious security circumstances. You can get across the. That means that's New Jersey on the other side, cut off from the island of Manhattan. All the tunnels are closed. The railroads are not operating, therefore, between New York and New Jersey. This island of Manhattan is pretty much frozen in place at the moment, while people wait and are reluctant to try to appraise the number of casualties that have been that have occurred in the World Trade Centers and their related area. But bear in mind that about 50,000, what did I say, Nancy? 50,000 people work in the trade towers. 80,000 people perhaps work in the adjoining areas. We've seen them in flight, and we have seen not one but 2 towers absolutely collapse upon themselves. And elsewhere in the country, we're still uncertain. There's still an unknown number of aircraft who've been ordered to land that haven't managed to get down to the ground. We're not absolutely certain that there are any aircraft on missions, if you will, which are unaccounted for, despite the fact there was a report some time ago that the aircraft which crashed outside Pittsburgh, may have been on its way to Camp David. I emphasize that that's reporting of which we're absolutely not very sure at all. But ABC's Barry Serafin is at the Capitol at the moment, and we've been told for some time that the Senate leadership there was going to be sent to a secure location. Do you have a current status report, Barry?
Well, Peter, we're not sure exactly what we're seeing here, but a few minutes ago, about 10 minutes ago, a military helicopter landed here behind me on the west lawn of the White House. And then a large group of people were seen to walk out to it, get on board, and fly right above us, over the mall in the direction of the Pentagon, perhaps. My guess, and it's only a guess at this point, is that these were members of the Senate leadership and the House leadership, and perhaps members of the intelligence committees on their way to a briefing to try to figure out what in the world is going on today.
Were you able to walk up around the hill?
No, Peter, we, like everybody else, have been kind of pushed off of the hill. They've got a cordon for blocks now around the Capitol. In effect, they've sanitized that area. So we're about 4 blocks from the foot of the hill here.
And do you have any sense was there a sense of anticipation there? People sort of waiting for something to happen at the Capitol?
Well, there is. Every time any kind of aircraft shows itself, and there haven't been many, there have been a few government helicopters moving around, all eyes turn to the sky, as you might imagine.
Precisely, Barry. Thanks very much. Barry Serafin, who's up at the Capitol. One of the things that is absolutely certain at the moment, which is to say that the chain of command in the country is very much in place. So you can just imagine yourself in some other country at the moment trying to anticipate, maybe even exhilarating at what's happening in the United States at the moment, and having some belief that you've disrupted everything. President's at 40,000 feet, just about to take off from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. We don't know where he's going, but I have to assume he's going to go to Washington. Cannot have the president being seen to be running around the country. By the way, the baseball games have all been postponed today. The entire Major League Baseball schedule has been postponed for today, as much as a mark of mourning and sadness for what happened in a variety of locations today. U.S. Earlier on evacuated embassies around the world. They're all quite familiar with that because on any number of occasions in the course of a year, you hear us say on the news that the State Department of the Pentagon has ordered a worldwide alert because something is going to happen or potentially going to happen. There's some kind of terrorist attack that's going to occur in some part of the world. The most recent terrorist alert, ironically, was in Asia over last weekend. In Japan and in South Korea, American embassies were put on alert because somebody somewhere in the military, in the intelligence establishment believed there was some potential for an attack. And it's something government has to do. It's something government has to do. Government has no choice, it argues. A lot of time you'll hear people saying, well, they've put up a state of alert again and nothing happened, and so they just do it all the time. It's very hard on Americans traveling overseas to be somewhere where there's a state of alert. But as John McWethy, who covers the military establishment for us, points out, is something government is obliged to do, lest something ever happened and there had not been an alert. John, are you there, John McKenzie? John McWethy?
John McWethy's here.
Yeah, John, I'm sorry, I was you. I was obviously talking about not John McKenzie. This is I guess what one notices more than anything else today. This was a place where there was no terrorism alert. Nobody, I gather, that you've talked today seemed to know anything.
One of the things that they have been studying so scrupulously over the last several months is how Osama bin Laden and other terrorist groups operate, Peter. They felt that they had some ability to monitor critical communications from these groups. I think it's going to be proved that the groups have learned some very important and deadly lessons from past terrorist events and the way the U.S. has been able to monitor them. It seems quite clear in this instance that they bypassed the normal methods of communicating and were able to organize this very complex operation in a way that basically escaped American detection.
But John, I'm sorry, but I think a lot of Americans will hear you talking and be reminded that how often the government tells us how much more sophisticated it is and how much better able they are to monitor all this.
They are able to better monitor it, Peter, but every time, and you and I know this because we have had conversations with high-ranking government officials about how much detail we put on the air. Every time the news media puts on these details, it helps the terrorists to understand the way that our government goes about monitoring their communications. Oftentimes, those communications intercepts are very sophisticated, but the terrorists are clearly adjusting.
John, I wonder, by the way, on a slightly different subject in terms of today's disaster, whether you picked up reports of U.S. aircraft carriers being sent to New York Harbor to help in some way, maybe even to be floating platforms?
I have not picked that up, Peter, but basically I'm standing on a highway at this point, so I'm not exactly plugged in.
I appreciate that, John, and we benefit tremendously from your knowledge, so thanks very much. Come back at us when you think of something else you'd like to contribute. We talk about the United States and Canada cooperated today in closing down the airports. A reminder to us that all Canadian airports, or most Canadian airports, at least major Canadian airports, are very close to the U.S. border. We learned just a short while ago that Israel today, United States and Israeli relationships so very close, closed all of its airspace to foreign aircraft today and evacuated many of its embassies and missions overseas. In terms of the war against terrorism, the United States and Israel are seen by the terrorists and the potential terrorists and the people who would do one harm as partners in this, and so it's perfectly natural for the Israelis to be doubly and trebly on a state of alert today. We've now managed to get the tape of President Bush speaking at Barksdale Air Force in Louisiana on his way from Florida to, as you heard Ann Compton say, somewhere. I assume Washington. And here's what the President had to say when he was in Louisiana.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status, and we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
Well, the President could not have spoken more accurately in that final remark there. A great nation is being tested. And the President reassures the nation and anybody else in the world who will hear this that the nation will pass the test. And there is no doubt about that, I think. In the United States of America, as horrible as these incidents are and as tragic as Oklahoma City was, the great strength of the nation, you know, is always there. I recognize that's one man's opinion and doesn't account for the individual shock of individual families or intelligence or military establishments, which have all suffered a grievous blow today in one way or the other. But it does say, I think, what people in most parts of the world believe, that as horrible as this is for the United States and its citizens, the United States continues to be unquestionably the leadership of the world and the example in the world of freedom and democracy. However much one may criticize it, ourselves included, on any given occasion or incident. It's interesting that in Oklahoma today, Governor Keating ordered all state office buildings closed, and the Oklahoma City Police created a one-block perimeter around the jail where Terry Nichols is housed. So again, you have an example of how people's minds work immediately. Was somebody going to try to spring Terry Nichols from jail, or was someone going to attack the jail in which Terry Nichols is housed? But in the wake of Oklahoma City, and based on what's happened this morning, nobody should be surprised. And the Associated Press has done a really good service here by checking with every state in the country so far. As you watch this on the East Coast of the United States, think about that. In California, all airports were closed. Places like Knott's Berry Farm were closed today. The Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles was closed. The Library Tower, all closed. And the State Emergency Committee convened, naturally under Governor Davis, to see that there was heightened security at all of the state buildings. In Florida, you know what happened. Walt Disney World was evacuated, closed its parks and shopping and entertainment complex. You're talking about the effect that this incident has all across the country. Airports were closed everywhere across the country, as we know, including in Georgia and Illinois, where the Sears Tower was also shut down, in Chicago, and all state government buildings in Chicago and in Springfield, the capital, were closed down. Indiana, all the federal offices were put on alert. In Kentucky, where the southern governors were about to have their full scope of their annual fall conference, it was canceled. And obviously the governors of Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Louisiana, Mississippi all went home to their respective capitals because of this. In Louisiana, where the president has just left, the upper floors of the Capitol building were closed. The offshore oil port, which handles the super tankers in the Gulf of Mexico, suspended operations. And we've said several times this morning that when you think about terrorism, you think about oil supplies, and so that was fairly natural. In Michigan, the tunnel between Detroit and Windsor, Ontario, was closed to car traffic, and we do know from other reporting that security was increased at all of the borders between U.S. and Canada and between the U.S. and Mexico. But in all the states where there are military bases, including North Carolina, all of the military bases prepared for a possible change in status, and you heard Governor Pataki of New York say a short while ago that the National Guard from various surrounding states will be brought in here to give some sense of relief for the New York City Fire and Police Department, who must just be going through a hellish experience at the moment. John Miller, first of all, you've been on the phone for a little while. Tell me what you got.
Well, as things have developed at the scene, there have been a number of things that have happened. First of all, nobody in city government can right now put a number, even a ballpark estimate on the number of injured and dead. What they've done to try and deal with the large numbers they have is literally brought in students from NYU Medical School to help in the massive triage effort down there. The nearest hospital, Beekman Downtown Hospital, has lost steam power as a result of the explosion, which means they can't sterilize anything. So they've essentially become a MASH center and are feeding people out to other area hospitals.
Another reason to get the National Guard in here quickly, because they come equipped.
Right. Another thing, as New York City hospitals became overwhelmed, ferry boats began to shuttle victims across the river to New Jersey, to hospitals in Jersey City and Bayonne.
We saw, by the way, some ferry boats on the Hudson River a little while ago. So that was them ferrying casualties across to New Jersey on the other side.
I spoke to some police officers that I know, police officers who used to work for me in the police department, who were at the scene, who gave the most incredible descriptions. First of all, police headquarters has been evacuated. There's a tiny skeleton crew there. It's considered a possible secondary target. They've moved police operations to another location, which we've been asked not to disclose, so that that doesn't become a possible target. The police commissioner is there now trying to get together enough information with the mayor and his people to actually brief us. Police precincts, and this is something eerie, Peter. We've touched on this before about a city, an American city in a free country going into lockdown. The 75 police precincts in New York have been sealed off in a one-block radius to traffic and pedestrians.
All of which, I have to tell you, is alarming, but seems common sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, on a day like today, when nothing seems normal, such incredible things actually seem prudent. One of the officers I spoke to on the telephone, who was there when the first building collapsed, said he was standing across the street. He was assigned to find a senior FBI official to get a briefing for the top command, and that the building fell. He said, I ducked behind a truck, and I closed my eyes and hit the deck. He said, I waited 30 seconds thinking that was enough. Then I opened my eyes, and it was night. It was complete blackness. He said, I began to crawl, and crawl for more than a block. And then I picked myself up off the street, but I still couldn't see. He said, a kid who was outside the major dust actually saw him struggling for sight, went in there and pulled him out and brought him into the church at Barclay Street, where he washed his eyes out with holy water to try and regain his vision. He was covered with dust and soot. These are the kind of human descriptions of the stories of people who were there at Ground Zero when the first building fell. Pressing for some kind of numbers, they said, all we have is preliminaries, and they're too small. He said the Port Authority believes they may have between 10 and 20 cops involved in the building, in the rescues, that are unaccounted for. The fire department, and this may be a lowball number also, between 80 and 100 firefighters.
An earlier report said there were 200 firefighters unaccounted for.
Unaccounted for at this time, and between 12 and 20 New York City police officers. Again, soft numbers, but unfortunately, the estimates are that rather than going down, they may go up. That's the fear.
This is the occasion, not one of those occasions. This is the occasion when a member of the police department, the fire department, or the military has got to respond only to the training. You just go into automatic and you do what you're trained to do.
It was amazing to me listening to the police radio traffic today, even as momentous disasters unfolded. I mean, the unspeakable. The collapsing of the Twin Towers, one after another, that while there was a high pitch to a lot of the voices and a little screaming and yelling, the rapidity with which calm was restored on the radio, and they went back to sending orders and continuing operations and acting in a logical manner, you really do revert to your training as a second nature.
As you look at this and you listen to John Miller, and I thank you, John, for that. No one is better plugged into the police and firefighting apparatus in New York City than John Miller. He not only been a reporter for most of his adult life, but he worked for the police department in New York for a while before he had the good sense to come back to journalism, and he is totally plugged in. But even, and when he talks about soft numbers here, it's because as you look at this disaster scene, and that's a live picture, that is a live picture 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 4.5 hours after this actually occurred, and you're looking at the smoke and the dust still emerging from the edges of these canyons in lower Manhattan, and the magnitude of trying to deal with these people, extends to moving them across the Hudson River in ferry boats, the ubiquitous ferry boat in New York harbors, not as necessary as they were in the days of greater ship travel, to the New Jersey side. And the Canadian television network, our partner, one of our partner television networks in Canada, is now reporting that American burn victims from here, I'm not sure whether it's the Pentagon or here, but I suspect it's from here, being transported as far away as Canada to Canadian hospitals there. And there you get some sense of how difficult it is to get a real grasp of how enormous this is, other than to say, as the mayor of New York and the governor of New York State both said to us a short while ago, I just don't want to touch the casualty figures as of now. Pierre Thomas, who's been with us for much of the morning, also reports from the FBI. And we may never know much more about one of the aircraft than this, that at least one of the planes this morning, we haven't got no more details than that, was able to communicate that it had been hijacked. In some cockpits, in some of the aircraft now being in use of commercial service, there's a button you can hit that sends a code to your headquarters that says you've been hijacked, so you don't have to try to tell the hijacker that you're actually talking to headquarters. But that's as much as we know about one of the several aircraft today which were involved in attacks on the United States. Now, Diane Sawyer at Times Square has been trying, I know as best she can, to get some handle on casualties vis-a-vis the people who are pouring into hospitals. Diane?
Right, Peter, here's all I know, and it's kind of postscript to what John Miller was saying earlier. With Beekman Hospital, the closest hospital, as he said, has been relatively out of commission. But St. Vincent's Hospital, which is one of those in the next perimeter, 25 major hospitals in New York, this is one of the next closest, told us just minutes ago they had 184 hospitalized, 2 dead. Now, again, we know that these figures are going to be changing almost minute by minute, so this is very early. But at this time, and by now we're talking just minutes ago, 184 hospitalized, 2 dead. They said to us again, though, remember that where the World Trade Centers used to be, there is now a mountain of rubble. We are talking 200,000 tons of steel, 425,000 cubic yards of concrete, and 43,600 windows with all the glass in them now just lying on the ground. So the excavation has only begun, but 184 right now from St. Vincent's.
Thanks, Diane, very much. And I must tell you, I feel a little embarrassed about trying to focus on casualties in numerical terms, only because it will ultimately give us some sense of the magnitude of this attack on top of the buildings themselves being brought to the ground, and similarly true at the Pentagon. So nobody feels gruesome, or it's not about the gruesomeness of the casualty figures. It is simply trying to get some sense of the magnitude in human terms rather than the physical terms, which so much of us in the country saw just before our eyes. Before I talked to John and to Diane, I was just running there briefly through various different parts of the country where the ripple effect of these attacks were felt. In Las Vegas, for example, this is back to the Associated Press report, which they did a really good job pulling the country together. Security was increased at all of casinos on the Strip in Las Vegas, because if you think about it, for the enemies of the United States, that kind of excess is seen as a symbol of the United States as well. The only place we could find all of the federal buildings open so far was in Vermont, where the federal buildings in Montpelier and Burlington were both open, and they have an atomic energy plant up there, and it was placed on a state of heightened security as well. Whereas in Nebraska, you'll see the first of probably many examples of this in the hours and days ahead. State employees were asked if they would give blood, because blood will be needed. There is a blood shortage in the United States, as we've heard time and again from the Red Cross. It's almost at a state of crisis in terms of blood collection in the United States at the moment, and so and what do you need in a time like this? You need blood, and you need plasma for all the people who have been hurt and damaged, and so that's important. And in Nebraska, state employees were responding to requests for blood donations, and at the Air Force bases out there, and then the security was heightened. And at churches all over the country, they're beginning to have these services, which will become part of the national fabric in the next couple of days, as people pray for the victims and those we hope are survivors of this. Terry Moran is at the White House, which is his normal beat. He didn't go with the president to Florida today. It's often the case that if the president's doing a purely political trip, we ask him to stay home to give us a broader sense of things. Well, Terry, what's the state of the White House as of now?
Well, Peter, the White House has pretty much been evacuated altogether. Just before it was evacuated, we are told that the national security team was taken to the secure situation room in there, but they are the only people in there. White House staff, most of the White House staff was told to go home. And the president, as you've heard, flew to Louisiana and is now en route, we don't know where. As he said, he is trying to make sure that the country knows that the government is still running. We've seen around town motorcades assembling outside the various cabinet departments, and we've just seen recently some traffic into the White House. So there is some government activity, but without the president at the moment.
Terry, there's a very small collection of reporters and camera team on board the President and Air Force One at the moment. I think the only reporter on board is Ann Compton, am I correct? Or certainly the only television reporter on board?
Well, actually, Ann is in the radio seat today. The pool, as it's called, is flying with the president. Today, CBS News is the pool. It alternates every day. Right. This pool will travel with him wherever he goes, and he made that statement that we saw earlier to the pool. The rest of the press who is accompanying the president to Florida, we are told, is now on a bus because of the air traffic shutdown from Florida back to Washington.
Terry, I wondered if, from your perspective of our White House correspondent, whether you agree with me, and certainly our political director, I think, who says that how the president now spends his time today, what he is seen to do, is absolutely vital, not just to the country, but to him.
Well, it's critical time for him. He said that the nation is being tested, the new president is being tested as well. But he has other restrictions on what he can do. That political mission he has to reassure the country and to show that he is leading it is actually secondary or even tertiary. The first thing is he has to keep himself safe. The Secret Service is going to insist that he be secured, and then second, he must remain in efficient strategic communication with United States forces around the world. That's undoubtedly why they took him to Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport. But you're absolutely right. The main thing he has to do for most Americans is communicate to them that he's in charge, that he intends to take control of this situation, and as he said, hunt down the people who are responsible for it and punish them.
Terry, I know you want to go back to your reporting. Is there anything else you want to add at the moment?
Well, Peter, it's just that this whole complex, which is usually abuzz with activity, which is really an office for hundreds of people, is now silent for the most part, and an armed camp, and that is a very striking thing for all of us who go to work there every day.
And what I notice is you're to the south of the South Lawn. You're on the southern side of the White House. We very often see you broadcasting from the other side of the White House. Why are you way down where you are?
Well, we've been cleared out of the North Lawn, which is where we normally broadcast from, and we are now, as you can see, south of the south ellipse of the White House. I can tell you that the evacuation of the White House itself, which has happened before with bomb threats and suspicious cars and packages, today did not proceed as orderly as it has. I was told by one of the White House staffers that their security official came in and said everybody should leave in an orderly fashion, and about a minute later an agent ran in and said, just run, get out.
Okay, thanks very much, Terry. We'll come back to you, but you get some sense from Terry Moran standing there, locked dramatically out of the out of the area with which he is so familiar. We saw some pictures earlier today, I'm here we get them up again for people who have just joined us, of people leaving the White House early on. First the White House police walking out fairly casually, and then as the tension began to build and the awareness of what was going on began to be heightened, people began to run outside of the White House. This is a place supposed to be, you know, quite extraordinarily secure. And he was, I think, than anything else, this concern that somehow the enemy, however one defines the enemy today, had control of airspace, and that they were able to approach these otherwise secure locations from the air, therefore making them more vulnerable. But the United States has not faced any emergency like this in the modern era, and as our political director, who's also working as hard as his unit can at the moment on this, points out, information is scarce because in situations like this, reporters like us rely on government officials to tell us what is going on with government and what sort of job government is doing, and the national government is pretty close to being on what amounts to a national war footing at the moment, and it's very difficult to reach government officials. So I see Pierre Thomas, who's just come to join us, and we'll talk to him in just a moment, that is trying desperately to reach all of his contacts in the FBI, and my guess is he's having a very hard time. At any rate, Linda Douglas is in Washington with us tonight, and she is with Joe Biden, the Democratic chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who will undoubtedly have something to say. Yes, Linda.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's been very difficult to get to you today because all the communications around the Capitol have really been shut down. As you know, earlier today, the entire Capitol was evacuated, the members of Congress, the staffs. There were some very frightening moments where they were shouting at us to get down. They thought something was going to happen. The leaders of the Senate were taken away early this morning to an undisclosed location by security, and security has also told other leaders of Congress to leave the area. The minority leader of the House, Richard Gephardt, was taken away in a Secret Service vehicle. And as you say, with me here is Senator Biden, who is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee and has just been meeting with other members of Congress and getting security briefings from the police mostly. But Senator Biden, what about this fear that has been communicated to the members of Congress by the security people that they should stay away right now from the center of the Capitol?
Well, I think maybe initially that made sense, Linda, but I don't think it makes sense now. The air is secure now with military planes. I think we should get back as quick as we can, Peter, into session. Now, I don't want to second-guess the security people. They want to be able to sweep the area, make sure everything's squared away. But I think we should be meeting tomorrow morning. Let the American people understand that these thugs who have done this incredible thing to the United States have not in any fundamental way altered our ability to do business. And so I think it's very important we get back to business. I've communicated that to the Majority Leader, Tom Daschle, who I think shares my view on that. And when I spoke to Senator Daschle, by the way, he was home, so he was here in town. There's a number of members of Congress. Congressman Brady from Philadelphia and a number of my colleagues are literally downstairs waiting for me now. So I think we have to show that we're up, we're ready to move. We are, in fact, nothing has fundamentally altered this government, and the tragedy that occurred to these thousands of people is one that we must, in fact, follow through and find out who's responsible for. But in the meantime, we should be calm and cool and collected about going about our business as a nation. Terrorism wins when, in fact, they alter our civil liberties or shut down our institutions. We have to demonstrate neither of those things have happened.
Senator Biden, a couple of the senators I've spoken to and members of Congress as well are saying that we are now at war. Senator Shelby, who is the ranking Republican on the Intelligence Committee, says we are now essentially at war. We have to be on a war footing. Senator Hagel has said that we've got to start securing our borders, locking down our airports, revisiting the way we protect our public institutions. What about that?
I hope that's not true. I would say it another way. I would say we've come face to face with a new reality, a reality that we knew existed and we knew was possible, a reality that has happened in varying degrees in other countries. But if, in fact, in order to respond to that reality, we have to alter our civil liberties, change the way we function, then we have truly lost the war. The war is one that allows us the way to conduct the war is to demonstrate our institutions are functioning, that your civil liberties, your civil rights, your ability to be free and walk and move around, in fact, are not fundamentally altered. Anybody who's willing to strap dynamite to their body or have a suicide kamikaze mission, you'll never fundamentally be able to stop. It doesn't matter what you do. There are a lot of things we can do, though, to diminish significantly the possibility of this happening again without changing our character as a nation.
Well, it's an amazing scene here, Peter. The skies are clear. There are usually planes in the sky. The skies are clear over the Capitol. The streets are completely empty. There is still smoke rising up from the Pentagon where the plane hit the Pentagon earlier. And as you can see, the members of Congress are all trying to grapple with what to do next. Senator Biden, of course, is going to be receiving all kinds of security briefings.
Linda, I have a question, if I may.
Yes, Peter. Go ahead.
I have a question for the Senator. I apologize via you. The Senator is the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, so he is party to all of the information in the intelligence community. Was the intelligence community so taken up with the idea of chemical and biological warfare against the United States that they didn't pay enough attention to this possibility?
Well, they clearly understood this was a possibility. The problem has been we have been focusing, in my view, I don't want to second guess anybody here. Look, the prospect of a chemical, biological, pathogen probability is real. Some of us, literally as recently as yesterday, I spoke to the National Press Club and talked about the fact that it's just as easy to fly from National Airport into the White House as it is to, do the same thing in New York. I mean, look, we know all these possibilities exist. And one of the things we have to do is we have to get our priorities straight in terms of what the real threats are that face us and use the assets we have to begin to deal with those threats. What I don't want everybody to think is this is some worldwide conspiracy where there's tens of thousands of people who are part of this army that attacked us. This is a group of people who are very well organized, obviously are relatively well funded, and we have to figure out how their network is worked, but we have to penetrate it. But it's not, this is not, we can't, Peter, just say we're going to focus only on this kind of incident and not on chemical and not on biological and not on pathogens, not on anthrax. This, in a sense, is the most god-awful wake-up call we've ever had.
Senator, let me ask you
how we have to redirect our resources.
Let me ask you one more question, then. I didn't realize you could hear me. At the Pentagon and at the State Department, you already hear people doing what they almost always do in an instance like this. This is so sophisticated it must be Osama bin Laden. Maybe so, but is the United States too focused on one man?
The tendency in these circumstances is to be too focused on one man, one idea, one prospect. I think that we should be calm. Those of us who hold high public office, just calm down a little bit, collect our thoughts, collect the information, and in a methodical way analyze what we know happened and what we can derive from that. I think it's much too early for us to make those kinds of judgments. The first thing is what the president is doing. He called for calm, he's getting in the airplane, he's coming back to Washington, D.C., and I applaud him for that. And we should be back up and running as quickly as we can. And I think we should do this. This cannot be dealt with overnight. It's an incredible tragedy. But it's the new threat of the 21st century that we are now facing, and we're going to find a way to deal with it. This nation is too big, too strong, too united, too much a power in terms of our cohesion and our values to let this break us apart, and it won't happen. It won't happen.
Many thanks, Senator. And Linda, do you want to add something? Linda Douglas?
Well, I just want to say that this is the beginning of what will clearly be an enormous, profound debate here in the Capitol. The dynamics of the debate in this country, as I've discovered in talking to members of Congress, have been fundamentally altered now. And here you're hearing a discussion of whether we should lock down, open up, and how we tackle this, and what our priorities are, and how we protect ourselves. So I've had just astonishing conversations with members of Congress, Peter, and there's a very grave feeling here right now in the Capitol.
Linda, thank you very much, and thank you, Senator Biden, as well. We'll have Linda Douglas available to us all the time, thank goodness, and Senator Biden says one of the most profound things about all this, which we've said several times this morning, which the terrorist wins when he or she manages to alter the behavior of a people or infringes on the way of life in a country that the country, a democratic country particularly, alters its way of life, because that's a step up for the terrorist in question, because it raises the whole question of civil liberties and access and freedom of movement. And Pierre Thomas has just come back to join us. You've had this tremendous argument from, covers the Justice Department for us. You had this tremendous argument in Washington as to whether or not that street out to Pennsylvania Avenue outside the White House should be open again to vehicular traffic or kept closed. I mean, terrorists is already winning in that one regard.
Absolutely. And members of Congress and members of the D.C. delegation in particular have been arguing to reopen Pennsylvania Avenue. The Secret Service has been adamant. You cannot reopen it. Oklahoma City showed the nation what can happen with a car bomb. Peter, I just got off the phone with a very senior FBI official, and he talked about the feeling of people being stunned at the FBI. The FBI Director Robert Mueller, the Deputy Director Tom Picard are at the Special Operations Center. They are communicating with the various field offices. And two bits of information. One, they said that there was communication from one of the planes noting that they had been hijacked. And I had a rather interesting conversation about that. He said, the problem is that there's no system in place once the plane notifies that it has been hijacked. No system in place to stop an ongoing attack. He said, think about it. If we had had time to notify the military would have had to make a decision. Do we shoot the plane out of the sky?
Well, both of you have to help me. You and John Miller have to help me on this, because they put this device in the cockpits so that notably airlines would know if one of the aircraft had been hijacked. But nobody really, I mean, I'm sure people did think, but not many people thought hijacks were going to lead to using these aircraft as full-scale kamikaze flights against public buildings and the other. I don't remember either one of you the last, if ever before, there's been the use of a civilian aircraft to attack a public installation in any country in the world. I may be wrong on that.
You know, it's certainly something so rare that I can't conjure one up. Two things come to mind. One, in or about 1980 or 81, a man with a gripe flew a plane in circles around the United Nations building, threatening to crash it into the building if his demands weren't met. And police helicopters went up, police hostage negotiators began to talk with him, and they literally talked him and his plane down in LaGuardia Airport, too, in 1994 or 5. On the day of the signing of the crime bill, ironically, a man crashed his plane into the White House. And I remember as a police official attending the signing of the crime bill with this plane sticking out of the White House's doorway under a shroud. So you've had those, but certainly nothing approaching this scale, and certainly nothing approaching this scale with passengers involved. I mean, you have the crash of Egypt Air Flight 990, where U.S. officials believe that the co-pilot intentionally crashed it into the ocean, but again, not into a target.
On the phone with us at the moment is the former National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration, Sandy Berger, who's now an independent consultant with a company that consults between the U.S. and foreign countries. Mr. Berger, do you hear me?
Yes, I do, Peter.
Hey, Sandy. I have one question for you, because it isn't so long ago that you were in and/or adjacent to the White House. This could have been on the Clinton watch as well as it could have been on the Bush watch. What would be the first thing you would have done?
Well, you know, the first responsibility here, obviously, is to the people who are trapped in these buildings. This is first and foremost an undertaking here of relief and rescue.
But that's not the job of the National Security Advisor.
Well,
what is the National Security Advisor?
This may involve the National Guard. It may involve other elements, and you have to. That obviously has to be our first priority. Second, securing, as clearly the government has done, other facilities that may be targets, and then. Looking at
can I just interrupt you again? Is there a book for this? Is there a book of rules, or do you just have to think, oh boy, we better lock down this, we better lock down that?
Well, you know, we have suffered a massive and coordinated attack here, Peter, beyond the scale of anything we have seen before, and be qualitatively different than anything we have seen before, and. The United States, we will determine who is responsible for this. The footprint here, so to speak, is large enough that we will know who is responsible, and America will respond. But we need to do it with determination and also with steadiness. We have to determine who is responsible, why this could happen without detection from so many different locations within the United States, and then respond accordingly.
All right, let me ask you this, because you've raised the issue. With all of the resources available to American intelligence agencies, not to mention your cooperation with foreign intelligence agencies, you've just said the footprint is large enough, we're going to find somebody. What on earth do you mean?
Well, we're talking about a number of planes. We've obviously had this operation happen relatively simultaneously. It's a sophisticated operation, and there's no question in my mind that we will determine who is responsible, and we will respond in a substantial and firm way. This has been a brutal attack against the United States.
Mr. Berger, you know better than I do that in the past we sometimes assign blame to people because it's important, but we don't always know who to blame. So can I ask you if you just see any clue this morning, if in your job as National Security Advisor, you see any clue, you would have done anything to begin to try to find out who might be responsible for this?
Well, I think it is. We have to be careful here not to jump to firm conclusions. We did that after Oklahoma City. We did that after the World Trade Center bombing. They were both wrong, but there are certain elements here, suicide bombings, which do have the character of radical militants from abroad. I think that's certainly where I know the intelligence community is focused intensely.
I have one last question for you, and it's really just a feeling question. You are now an independent consultant helping American businesses do business overseas, or helping other, get through the American bureaucracy. When you talk to your friends and contacts overseas, will they see the United States as weakened by this?
Well, I think it depends very much, Peter, on how we react as a country. We have suffered a grievous attack, but if America here has to respond with steely determination, but also with steadiness, and that means, first of all, dealing with the victims, dealing with security, finding out who's responsible, and taking whatever action is necessary and appropriate. It also means continuing to expect and demand the highest level of cooperation from the rest of the world in going after this kind of terrorist threat. This is not just an attack on the United States, it's an attack on the civilized world. And it ought to be seen as an attack on our European friends, on our Middle East friends, and on others. And the response here cannot simply be an American
airstrike
response.
Somewhere. In other words, you can't just mount an airstrike against somebody. It won't be satisfying, right? It may be satisfying, won't be satisfactory.
Certainly, you don't rule out a military component of this, but you also have to get to the root of this.
Okay, Sandy Berger, thank you very much. Former National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration, one of the most important members of the foreign policy establishment in the Clinton administration, now an independent consultant, as people in government tend to do when they leave government. It's been hard this morning as we continue to look at the smoke and the dust drift up from a crime scene, as John Miller called it, which we cannot feel in any intimate way on television, only through our reporters and through getting closer in and talking to the cops and the firefighters and the survivors. But we will in time get in there. But in the meantime, we've been trying very hard to figure out all of these airplanes. Because we have a couple of we've got 4 significant aircraft today which have been involved in disasters. And we've asked Lynn Scher, one of our reporters, to try to nail down what we know and what we don't know. Lynn, are you there?
I am, Peter. As you point out, it was airplanes that were the weapons of destruction today, not bombs, passenger planes. We actually know very little for sure about what happened, but we do have some details. And bear with me because the information keeps changing. But I want to start with the only one that horribly we actually did see happen. And this, of course, was the plane that crashed into World Trade Center number 2. That, of course, was the South Tower. That's it on the right. Now, and there's the flame from it. What you're seeing is the North Tower. Behind it, there's a second identical tower. As you know, that plane crashed right into it. All morning, we have been told by American Airlines, among others, that that flight, that airplane, was actually American Airlines Flight 77 going out of Dulles to Los Angeles. We were told 58 passengers, 4 flight attendants, 2 pilots on that plane. It was hijacked at 9:03, I'm sorry, it was hijacked right after takeoff, crashed into the tower at 9:03 a.m.
Let me stop you right there, Lynn, because I've had different information, so I'm going to rely on you here. You now believe that American Airlines Flight 77, which took off for Dulles on its way to Los Angeles, crashed into the trade towers, not into the Pentagon.
We were told that originally. What I'm about to tell you is that the FBI is now saying that that's the one that went into the Pentagon. The FBI spokesperson is saying that the flight that went into World Trade Center Tower number 2, that South Tower, was in fact United Airlines 175, a Boeing 767 that left Boston for LAX, departed at 7:58 a.m. this morning. 56 passengers, 2 pilots, 7 flight attendants. This is confusing. I apologize. We are getting 2 different answers to our questions. What I can tell you that appears to be accurate is that the plane that crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:45 a.m. was in fact American Airlines Flight 11, American 11, going from Boston to LAX, 7:59 a.m. departure, hijacked right after takeoff, 81 passengers, 9 flight attendants, 2 pilots. We know of 1 other aircraft involved in today's episode, Peter, United Airlines Flight number 93. This was another Boeing 757, left Newark at 8:01 this morning en route to San Francisco. 38 passengers, 2 pilots, 5 flight attendants. It went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, which is near Johnstown, which is just southeast of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I believe we have some video of that crash site right there, and that's where this flight went down. We are waiting for a press conference from the airlines to try to make some of this clear to us, but right now that is all the information we have on those 4 planes.
Can I just absolutely confirm, because I'm trying to make it even clearer for people, though you did a much better job than I did. This is from the FBI spokesperson you're talking about, right?
What I'm telling you is that the FBI spokesperson has said United Airlines 175 from Boston to LAX is the one that went into the World Trade Tower number 2, the South Tower. The FBI is also telling us that it is American 77 from Dulles to LAX and to Los Angeles Airport that went into the Pentagon.
Okay, thanks very much. So what we have now in terms of the trade towers, we have 1 American Airlines aircraft, 1 United Airlines aircraft, which hit the 2 trade towers, and we have a 2nd American Airlines aircraft, which goes into the Pentagon, and we have a 3rd aircraft, United Airlines, which we have no idea about, either whether it was on a mission or for what reason it crashing southeast of Pittsburgh today. But 3 major aircraft today carrying considerable numbers of passengers and crew on board are all down, at least three of which appear to have been involved in a coordinated attack on the United States. I should also tell you that ABCnews.com plays an important role in our life all the time, but it's very important at a moment like this, and has a good many offerings up at the moment, including a continuous reporting of the work we're doing here on television and they're doing on their own. There's a reader messenger board up there, as always, and that very often provides information. It has a lot of reporting on the status of air travel and the FAA response, most of which I think we've reported here, but if you want to get it locked into your mind, you can go to abcnews.com. And then there is a lot of reporting, as there always is at abcnews.com, about the ramifications of this to individuals, to communities, and to the country as a whole. Tony Cordesman is in Washington at the moment. And Tony, since I talked to you last, I'm not sure how much more we or you have learned about this attack or the coordinated nature of it. Have you learned any more?
I think, Peter, as you watch this develop, you have to say that we have never before seen any group that could put together this level of targeting, because the targeting is very precise, the ability to take over a complex platform like an aircraft. And one thing we have to ask ourselves is whether the pilots that were on the aircraft originally flew them, or you had people trained to fly one single mission, to crash those aircraft against a target. The timing is a level of coordination we really haven't seen used anywhere else in the world. So we're watching a movement which, as Jack McQuethy has pointed out, not only is remarkably silent and lacking in communication, but every time we turn on the news and see another development, it points to a higher level of sophistication and a higher level of preparation.
All right, Tony, let me play devil's advocate here just for a second, or maybe I should say ignorant advocate. I accept the notion that this could be a very, very sophisticated operation, required communications on a level that our intelligence or the U.S. intelligence services don't appreciate. But is it not similarly possible that three members, just three men of one organization, could agree on, what is the date today? The 11th. On the 11th of the month at such and such an hour would try to hijack three airplanes and try to crash them into a building. Might it not be as simple as that?
No, Peter, it simply can't be, because first, flying an aircraft into a building, a pilot is not going to commit suicide in ways that kill thousands of extra people. It is not something that you're going to do by pointing a gun at a pilot's head.
Okay.
You're not going to take an aircraft out of pattern and suddenly divert three aircraft without creating virtually any warning, because the attacks are so close together. You're not going to be able to bypass the security measures in three different airport locations. You're not going to be able to take over an aircraft with one man, particularly if you want it to fly a suicide mission. And you are not going to be able to add to this potential additional cases where aircraft have crashed that may also have been at terrorist hands.
Very interesting. Now, Tony, let me just take this a step further. Your business of the pilot issue is really to the point, which was, who knows, a commercial airline pilot who's going to deliberately fly his aircraft into a building, even at the cost of his own life in the cockpit. So you do presume that somebody else is in the seat flying this aircraft.
That's right, Peter, and I think we need to understand that the very sophistication of these aircraft make them much easier to fly, that it is much easier to program them to change their course. It doesn't take a pilot with vast experience to fly one mission ending in killing large numbers of people. But they do have to be trained. They do have to know something about the simulator, at least, inside the aircraft. And even if they have the pilot under their control, they have to know a lot about the way planes fly to force a pilot to be so precise in their targeting.
You make very good points, and you therefore assume that there is a lot of money involved in an operation like this.
I think that's a dangerous assumption, Peter.
Okay.
We always use these phrases, $100 million or $10 million. What it requires is a lot of political commitment, ideological commitment. It isn't something three people can do. It is potentially something that perhaps 30 or 40 can do. It is possible that only one major cell of some terrorist organization is involved. But I think we also have to ask another question now, and that is whether some state that hosted this movement knew about it and assisted, because there are elements of sophistication which raise that prospect.
Stay with us for a second, Tony, because Vince Canestraro, who also talks on the subject of terrorism and does more than talk on the subject of terrorism for us, is also here at the moment. Vince, do you want to make some comments about this?
Yeah, Peter, I think that Tony makes some good points about the complexity and the sophistication of the operation. But I think also we have to see what kind of organizations in the past have been willing to do such a coordinated attack. And,
why is that a clue?
Because it's a pattern. We see people who committed suicide in these operations. So that points us away from a secular organization to a religiously oriented group. We've seen a pattern of planning against 5 U.S. airliners in 1993 with Ramzi Youssef when his safe site was inspected in Manila in '93. The FBI found evidence that he had been planning to hijack and blow up in flight 5 United airliners flying out of the Far East. Now, that was a very ambitious operation, and I don't think anyone believed that he could actually have done it. But here we are some 8 years later, and we see a coordinated operation and 3 planes hijacked and blown up against targets, obviously suicide operations, bringing a lot of other people with them. So that tends to point us towards a religiously organized group, perhaps towards Al-Qaeda, but again with some state support. We've seen these groups evolve in their professionalism over the last several years. We go from...
Vince, can I just interrupt you for one second, just to try to keep you on the straight and narrow here? It may be a reach to blame. It may be a reach to blame a religious organization. I agree that we've come to accept the notion that some members, some people who worship Islam in the Middle East have found a better life giving themselves up, as we say. But aren't you sort of already directing and creating something of a mindset about an investigation that's more complicated than that?
Oh, certainly. This group, whatever it was, had some professional support, perhaps from a military and a state. The explosives, the way you would fly an aircraft. But it does point towards a group that has members who are willing to kill themselves in carrying out a punishing act against the United States. And there are only a few groups like that that we know of. Secular radical Palestinian groups traditionally don't do this kind of thing.
Right.
We haven't seen that. The ones that we've seen that carried out suicide bombings tend to be Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, and of course Hezbollah. And so you've got basically a handful of potential suspects. None of this proves anything, of course, but it does tend to focus an investigation.
Let me ask you both, you, Vince, and then Tony Cordesman second. Just on the basis of history and on the basis of your own individual expertise, what do you think the chances are of the United States finding out who did this? First of all, you, Vince.
I think that there's a fairly good chance of finding out who did this because the people who did this are going to brag, they're going to talk, they're going to try and claim credit in a way that doesn't bring attention directly to them. But they will talk to other people, and some of our intelligence resources will pick this up, and that will lead us in a certain direction. And then they will go back to the database of threat warnings that they've had in the recent past. The U.S. has had a worldwide terrorism alert for some time that was just renewed yesterday, but again, the focus of those threats was abroad, U.S. installations abroad. They'll go back and see whether or not some of their intelligence operations that were picking up these threats may have been the recipient of deception. In other words, the group that may have done this may have been broadcasting deceptive information that we thought was legitimate threat information against a foreign installation while they were really planning to do this kind of an operation.
Thanks very much, Vince Canestrano. I'll go to Tony Cordesman right away, but I just want to remind people, if you watched the news yesterday, you noticed that you recall that we reported that a man named Ahmad Massoud, who was the last independent militia leader, not member of the Taliban in Afghanistan, was, we believe, killed. There's still some debate about whether he's dead or not, but certainly was attacked by his enemies, one of them disguised as a television cameraman. And the United States was very open to admit that what the United States lost when Massoud was killed yesterday was access into Afghanistan for U.S. intelligence operatives. And so I turn now to Tony Cordesman for a quick comment on how quickly, how easily, how complicated, how difficult, how impossible might it be to find out who did this?
Peter, let's consider several realities. We never found and punished the people who blew up the Marine Corps barracks.
In Beirut.
That's right. We have never really addressed who led the attack on Al-Khobar, and the people who've been punished were at the lowest possible level.
Those are the civilian and military barracks in Saudi Arabia.
That's right. And when we go back to Libya and what happened to Pan Am 103, one person has been imprisoned. We have never gone beyond attacking low-level people in an incident of this magnitude to attack the leaders and the core of the group with success, but we have never before really encountered things so serious that we are on the edge of war.
And in the case of Pan Am 103, the United States alternated between blaming Syria for supporting the operation and or Libya, which supported the operation. So you're really reaffirming how complicated this is.
More than that, Peter, I think the key element is that if any state is involved in this in any way, if it knew this was going to happen or it shoulders a movement once we identify it, we find ourselves with issues about war and peace which we have never before encountered in terrorism.
Well, you certainly put your finger on one more part. I'd like you to hold that, Tony, for a second, because nothing could be more, in some respects, potentially dangerous at the moment. But let's not lose focus for today. We'll come back to Tony Cordesman and talk about American reaction to the rest of this world. But in the meantime, we have a disaster here in New York City, which is a national disaster, and we have a disaster in Washington because there's been an attack on the nation's military establishment. And we have at least one major plane crash in Pennsylvania today, which we believe is related, but in its own way is a national disaster, as the crash of a major airliner often is. And I want to go to, before we get carried away by theory on terrorism, no offense to my colleagues, let's go back to Lower Manhattan, where Bob Jameson is with George Stephanopoulos. And Bob has been visiting hospitals in the last little while, and so I think the two of you together can bring us up to date on the scene.
George, if I might, I'll start first because I've just returned from St. Vincent's Hospital, which, Peter, is a little more than a mile from the World Trade Center and is a principal destination today for those who were injured in this disaster. And as one measure of how large it is, by midday there were about 200 people, 18 of them critically injured, who were brought to St. Vincent's, which is about 20 more than were injured, than were brought to St. Vincent's after the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. The injuries that the doctors are reporting are not principally respiratory injuries, which was the case in 1993, but these are largely crushing injuries. And Peter, 5 hours after the first plane went into the World Trade Center, ambulances are still arriving regularly at St. Vincent's. They are conducting triage, classifying the degree of injury outside on the sidewalk in front of St. Vincent's, and they don't have a clear idea of how many more injured may go there, as well as the other hospitals in New York, and now we hear some in New Jersey.
And Peter, that's in part because we've just got a report from John McKenzie out in the field who talked to William Hull, the head of the Port Authority, who said that formal search and rescue operations haven't even begun yet. The bulk of the effort right now by the police and the fire department and others is simply to establish the integrity, the safety of the World Trade Center building. Second, what's left on the site of the World Trade Center. Secondly, Peter, they reported that there's a staggering number of firefighters still on the site, up to 200 that they can't account for yet. They were able to talk to one firefighter on the scene, though, who said that their biggest problem now is not having fire hydrants to put out these small pockets of fires that are cropping up all across the site. And secondly, Peter, there's a problem now with broken gas lines, which they fear could ignite further explosions.
George, could
Peter,
I just...
if I might add,
yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Just to add one thing. I was struck by something at St. Vincent's. The Red Cross, as you may know, has put out a plea for blood donors, particularly those with the less common types of blood, such as O. But even before that plea went out, thousands of people spontaneously showed up at St. Vincent's, thousands of people, and many of them told us this is what we think we can do to help. We can't do anything else. Sitting at home watching on television won't help, but this might.
Well, Bob, you're quite right. And in fact, no reason you would have heard us, but we mentioned a short while ago that blood donors in Nebraska, one of their first instincts, or people in Nebraska, one of their first instincts was to go and respond to a request for blood donations because, as you've just pointed out and we've said before, there's a critical shortage of blood in the United States. And we've heard from the Red Cross any number of times in the last year or so that the country needs blood and it's not going to be available. And so it is reassuring to hear in New York City people doing that instinctively. Bob, let me ask you both, and start with you and then George. My sense of the recovery, if that's the word for it, of this phase of what's going on down there is to deal with people who are injured, who are clearly not in or under the World Trade Towers. Am I right?
Yes, I think that's correct, and a large number of them, in one way or another, are some of the emergency and rescue people. And then the next step, as we have seen in other disasters, will be to see who else there is.
And George, we've seen buildings collapsed. It sometimes takes days to discover people under collapsed buildings, and we now have a circumstance. Do we have any idea how many people got out before the building collapsed? We don't, do we?
Not a very good idea, Peter. We do know that there was some warning. As I said earlier, we spoke to some of the security guards who were on the site, and they did have some warning. There was a feeling that the second building was going to collapse, so the evacuation did begin from people as high up as in the 82nd and 86th floors, but we don't know how many were able to get out. And we do know, Peter, from at least one of the security guards, that they were nowhere near complete. They hadn't come even close to completing the evacuation, but we don't have numbers.
And Peter, adding a little bit to the confusion, the collapse of the North Tower may have affected other buildings around there, as well as the collapse of the Millennium Hotel.
Well, thank you both very much, and both of you come back at any time that you want and can or contribute to this. We can tell you that the military. Thank you both very much, Bob Jameson and George Stephanopoulos.
Thank you.
We can tell you that the military. The governor said earlier, the governor of New York, that the National Guard was going to come in, and there's National Guard on station in some parts of the city anyway, is setting up a temporary morgue on the piers in New York City near West 57th Street, which is where people often take off to go and have a tour of New York City from the air, and close by where the famous Circle Line leaves, so people can take a tour around the island of Manhattan and see what it looks like. And none of that traffic is permitted today. The only traffic we have seen on the Hudson River has been, as has been pointed out to us several times, John Miller particularly, pointing out that ferries are taking wounded across the river, across the Hudson River to New Jersey. ABC's Cynthia McFadden is on the phone at the moment. She is calling us from Bellevue Hospital, which is over on the east side of Manhattan, quite some distance from this. Sylvia, do you hear me? Cynthia, do you hear me?
I do, Peter.
Can you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah, we've been able to get into the Disaster Command Center, which is located here at Bellevue. As you say, it's about 20 or 30 blocks north and east of the actual site of the Twin Towers. But this is where the city puts its resources to prepare for an emergency. They rehearse here, practice here for disasters, and today we were allowed in the first group of journalists to go inside and see where they were running the disaster relief from. Let me paint a picture for you, if I might, of the room. It's about a 30 by 15 room, about 10 people crowded around a conference table, about 15 phone lines coming into the room. The mayor's office, emergency services, police and fire, all of those efforts being coordinated through this room. It was surprisingly calm, surprisingly quiet. It is located in the heart of the emergency room here at Bellevue Hospital, Peter, and the emergency room itself is busy. They've had about 140 to 150 people come through Bellevue so far. We've also had the opportunity to talk to the director of the hospital here and to the man who heads up the emergency room. I can tell you a little bit about the injuries if you'd like.
Please do.
Because this is a hospital further away, they're getting the less seriously injured, although, having said that, of the 140 or 50 people, 40 of them are classified in serious condition. 2 were dead on arrival. They have 1 baby who is being treated. 3 to 5 operating rooms are currently going with what the doctor characterized as extremely serious surgeries. The doctor running the operation here said that they have sent a team of physicians closer to the site, and they're going to be setting up tent hospitals closer to the site to help some of the enormous flow of injuries. Nobody made it here to this hospital until about 2 hours after the blast. And they believe, I've been listening to the coverage, they believe that it's not going to be for another many more hours until they feel the full brunt of this over here.
Okay. Thank you, Cynthia, very much. Come back to us, please. When you get even better handle of this. We've talked a little bit about the blood shortage, which, as I said, is a national issue, but in New York City there are supplies of blood so far. People did respond very quickly and lined up ready to give blood at some of the blood centers here. There is a supply of O-type blood. O negative appears, as best we can understand from the people who are collecting it, is the most important kind of blood needed at the moment because it's the universal donor, meaning anyone can actually get it. Now, there's a slight bit more of information, like all information today, reasonably suspect at the outset, but the Associated Press is reporting that this airliner, this United Airlines jet, which crashed in Pennsylvania, which is a American Airlines, my apologies, United Airlines Flight 93. I don't quite know exactly what aircraft it was, a 767, I think, which we assessed uncertain about, did not know why it had crashed, whether it was part of this overall operation this morning. The AP is now quoting a man who minutes earlier, saying he was a passenger on the plane, told an emergency dispatcher in a cell phone call that we are being hijacked. We are being hijacked. Treat that, as you do all the information we give you today, as being preliminary at best, sometimes wrong. I think we've been pretty good about it today, and certainly confused, because listening to the mayor, listening to the governor of the state, both of whom we talked to, listening to the senator in charge of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, listening to all of our analysts, listening to everybody, the country is still very much in the middle of, if not immediate post-event chaos, certainly in terms of trauma, and trying to get a handle on what the hell's been going on here. And as we've said before, when you look at the television pictures of the Trade Center collapsed upon itself, these are
the canyons of Manhattan, when the World Trade Center, first one building, one tower, and then the other began to come down. There is a real funnel effect in those narrow corridors in lower Manhattan, and the winds did take on a kind of tornado-like force. Ron Insana and others who work for NBC, who were in the midst of all that, described it as pitch dark and terrifying for a full 2 minutes at least. Many of them had to seek sanctuary either by breaking through windows, as Ashley Banfield did, into an apartment building, or getting into a car. CNBC's Ron Insana remains with us now. Ron, you've now been able to see those other videotapes that we've been showing of what it's like down there, and I think you used the phrase earlier, nuclear winter, and that's so apt.
And Tom, in some ways, I mean, if you can envision again that scene in Independence Day, that terrifying alien movie that showed New York City exploding in a horrific fireball without the fire, that is exactly what the corridors in lower Manhattan looked like. That's those huge plumes of smoke ripping through the streets and really overwhelming the entire community. It stretched for many, many blocks, the after effects of the implosion of that building, and to be standing in the middle of it, it was indeed pitch black, and had there not been an open car in which to hide, I'm not quite sure in what capacity I would be right now. But for quite a considerable time after the building came down, the air in lower Manhattan was thick, deep gray, unbreathable in many ways. Many people trying to take refuge in buildings that were open to the extent that there were some, or in automobiles, or any place where they could get breathable air.
All right, CNBC's Ron Insana, who was one of the survivors today when he went through to cover the story, and then the building began to come down. No one could have anticipated that it would happen as swiftly or as catastrophically as it did. It does lead one to wonder whether there was a secondary explosion of some kind within the building, although it did take, in both instances, a terrible, terrible hit at the top. These buildings are secure. The World Trade Center was bombed in 1993. It managed to survive that. But nonetheless, the full effect of these two airliners, both considerable in size with a lot of fuel on board, brought down two of the iconic buildings in Manhattan. Let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell now, who has been keeping track of national security matters and the State Department. Secretary of State Colin Powell is en route back from Peru, we're told. Andrea, do we think he'll come to Washington?
That's correct, Tom. We're not sure that he will come to Washington. He's en route back from Lima, Peru. He was to have gone to Bogota, Colombia today, never got that far. He was at an OAS, an Organization of American States meeting in Lima, Peru, and gave a statement about this terrible attack on our nation, an attack which he described as a military attack, and then left. We're not sure where he is going to be going. As you know, the Vice President is at a secure location, Mrs. Bush at a secure location. Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, was conducting National Security Council meetings in the Situation Room at the White House, even though the White House was evacuated. The State Department Operations Center relocated across the river to another location in Virginia. And George Tenet, the CIA director, was still holding meetings, but in a secure, separate location in Langley, while the rest of the CIA did evacuate. The CIA director on February 7th testified to the Senate Intelligence Committee that there was one person who was capable of coordinated, sophisticated, multiple attacks on the United States with no warning, and that was Osama bin Laden. Now, obviously, there are other collateral groups such as Al-Qaeda in Egypt, based in Egypt, that are closely associated with him, and it's very easy to, as Warren Rudman has warned us against, to speak without knowing fully who is really responsible. But clearly he is top on their list of possible suspects because of motive, because of means, because of opportunity, because of finances. And as Senator Rudman pointed out to you, this is the kind of attack, Tom, that had to be organized for many, many months. Just as we discovered during the testimony by bin Laden associates who were turned by the FBI and testified in the World Trade Center bombing trial, and also in the trial, of course, of the embassy bombings. These people work for months in advance. This is not a response, let's say, to recent events in the Middle East. This is something that was in the planning for many, many, many months.
Yeah, this is a terrible wake-up call for America. So many times we're lulled into the impression that far-off events don't have an effect on us in this country, or when there is a shooting at the CIA, as there was a few years ago, or when we had the bombing of the World Trade Center. Those trials went on, didn't generate a lot of attention. But Andrea, let's talk for just a moment, if we can, about foreign policy in the United States, about what was on the agenda before this day. The President was going to China in October. The UN meeting will be coming up in the fall. How will all this be affected?
Well, all of these events will be affected in extraordinary ways. We had already seen that economic and global meetings could no longer be held without not only the threat of protests, but without massive protests interrupting the schedule of international gatherings. The UN meetings in New York in September were already going to be very, very difficult to conduct, always have been, as you know, but now it is.
And I'm Tom Van Houten, the Wood TV newsroom. The whole country, and West Michigan is included in that, is responding to this tragedy by praying. Linda White joins us live from downtown Grand Rapids with more.
Oh, Tom, a couple things here, kind of a laundry list of items to go through. Please take note. First of all, the election, the citywide election will go on. It's the first ward primary election. It is not canceled. While there may be events at your school canceled this evening, the polling places are open. So please, if you plan to vote, maybe if you weren't, go down and vote. The first ward primary is going on as scheduled. There are several prayer vigils all over the city. Check with your local churches, but you should know there is a citywide prayer vigil at the Martin Luther King Park. That is sponsored by the city of Grand Rapids. If you choose to do that, please do so. Lots of prayer vigils going on. I know there's one going on at Cornerstone that happened at about 1:30. There's another one at 8 o'clock at St. Andrew's Church, another large parish in town. Grace is also having a prayer vigil. Please keep in mind that prayer vigil at Martin Luther King Park, a citywide prayer vigil, that starts at 6 o'clock. You should also know the mayor told press just a few moments ago that the city is under heightened security. No buildings, though, city or county buildings have closed. We have reported already to you at noon and on other updates that the federal building, the IRS building, have closed. Those are federal buildings. However, city and county buildings are not closed. The mayor talked about people ought to just get up tomorrow morning, wash themselves off, and continue about their business. Certainly, so many people are concerned about what happened, but please check with your local churches about prayer vigils everywhere happening this evening. And once again, the citywide prayer vigil going on at Martin Luther King Park. That's at 6 o'clock, sponsored by the city of Grand Rapids. I'm Linda White. Now back to you.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Grand Valley State University terrorism expert Jonathan White says today's attack reflects the change in the structure of warfare and terrorism. He says this country's superior military strength forces enemies to use their limited power against our non-military targets. And he says terrorists used to commit spectacular acts with limited casualties because they wanted to get people to join them. Now, he says, foreign and domestic terrorists are anchored in religion with different results.
They are full of uncompromising, unbending fundamentalism, venom and hate, nothing to do with Islam, Christianity, or Judaism. And they essentially call for the death of demonic forces. When you call for the death of demonic forces, what you endorse and what religious terrorists do endorse is mega death. Killing people because you're not playing for a wider audience, you're playing for yourself, and you're answering directly to a deity.
It's a new kind of war. Hundreds of West Michiganders are trying to help the injured in New York and Washington by giving blood, but officials at the Grand Valley Blood Program are asking that people pace themselves right now. The lines at the blood bank are so long, and so is the wait to give blood. And given the massive numbers of injuries on the East Coast waiting to be treated, the need for blood is going to be long-term.
Well, we have a lot of donors coming in today, and that is just wonderful. But if they could possibly stagger out their donating over the next few days, in the next few weeks, that would be the best thing we can do, because that way we'll have a constant blood supply ready for the needs of, the emergency situation.
So if you want to give blood, call them up, give them your name, and then when they need you, they'll call you back. Be sure to stay with Wood TV and NBC News for continuing coverage of this national tragedy.
As the magnitude of the devastation continues to unfold across our country, so does the outpouring of concern from West Michigan. Here is what you can do to help. The Grand Valley Blood Program asks that you come in over the next few days to keep up the blood supplies. The Red Cross is asking for monetary donations. International Aid is recruiting relief teams. The Salvation Army is also taking donations. 24-hour News 8 will continue to bring you more information on how you can help the victims and their families. Also log on to woodtv.com.
Federal government from the time of the first attack has been excellent, including closing off the airspace around Manhattan and doing everything that can possibly be done in the face of this barbaric act to make the city secure. And we will strive now very hard to save as many people as possible and to send a message that the city of New York and the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists, that our democracy, that our rule of law, that our strength and our willingness to defend ourselves will ultimately prevail. And I'd ask the people of New York City to do everything that they can to cooperate, not to be frightened, to go about their lives as normal. Everything is safe right now in the city, and the people who are doing the relief effort need all the help they can get. And then, Governor, thank you very much for your assistance and your help and your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, for your leadership through this crisis. This is a vicious attack upon New York. It's an attack upon America. It's an attack upon the whole concept of freedom and our way of life. And we cannot let these attacks succeed. First step has to be to make sure we do everything in our power to protect the people and to save the lives of those whose lives are still at risk, and to help those who have been injured. And I want to commend the mayor, and I want to thank my colleagues from Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the federal government have all offered and made ready support to help us deal with this ongoing crisis. The people of New York are not only the freest and most diverse people in the world, we're also, I believe, the most capable of rising to meet meet the challenges of this type of attack. And right now, we want New Yorkers to remain calm, to go about their business, to appreciate the fact that everything to provide for their safety is being done, to appreciate that everything that can be done to provide for the health and the needs of the people who are still at risk is being done, and that we will continue to work to make sure that we get through this as strongly and quickly as possible. I want to thank the federal administration. Secretary Thompson has been on the phone with me a number of times, as well as the President, for what they are offering and prepared to do. And we're just confident that, while this is a horrible attack and one that is despicable and really unthinkable in its magnitude, we will get through this, and we will continue to have a great and free country, state, and society.
Do we know the number of casualties at this point, sir?
I don't think we really want to speculate about that. The number of casualties will be more than any
Mayor Giuliani
of us can
and
bear.
Governor Pataki, the two Republican leaders of this state, joined together here in this day of common tragedy for them and dealing with a crisis of unbelievable proportions for both of them. Is this city has been struck in an act of war by terrorists. You're looking now at the Manhattan Bridge, which leads out of Lower Manhattan into the various boroughs. That one going over into Brooklyn. Those of you who come to New York always remember the Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Williamsburg Bridge in that sequence from the lower part of the city on BMW. These are people who didn't have access to subways or cars because the tunnels are closed, and they're walking home, as any number of people are. New York, as Governor Pataki said, is so diverse in so many ways, but it is always united with the enormous sense of pride and survival and people helping each other as they are today. And that is the lower end of Manhattan, one of the great cities in the world that has been struck in an act of war today by two hijacked airliners, the hijackers unknown. Richard Shelby of Alabama, Senator, Senate Intelligence Committee. We're told that you've been getting a briefing. What do we know at this hour, Senator?
I've had a partial briefing, but after 4 o'clock this afternoon, I've been told that some people with the CIA and the FBI is going to brief Senator Bob Graham, who is the chairman of the committee. I'm the vice chairman. I was a former chairman. As to the events, what they know up to this point, who's responsible at this point. It's a little premature, but about 30 minutes ago I was talking to some people. Everybody's deeply concerned about what happened. We should be. You mentioned war. This is war. I've said several times that this is a different type of war. It has no boundaries. We've been pushing the intelligence committees for 7 years now that I've been on the committee to do everything they can, and I think we've got to do more. But my first thoughts, Tom, go out to the families. You know, this is a terrible, terrible day for America. It's a wake-up call, though.
And what do we do after we get the wake-up call in terms of how this country must change? Obviously, security at airports will have to be tightened considerably when you have 4 planes taken, including one from the nation's capital. What else is going to have to happen?
Well, that's one, and I think we can do much better around the airports. I think we've come a long way with security. We're an open society. We want to stay that way because that's what makes this country great. We cannot hunker down and live in bunkers. We will not, I predict. But I think we can do a lot more. I'm waiting the briefing as to see if there was any inkling, any warning whatsoever. If not, then this was a heck of a well-executed, dastardly deed today. And I'm afraid it'll be more.
And that's the other question I was going to ask you in that partial briefing. Did you get any assurance that the worst seems to be over?
No, they wouldn't say that. They would be very careful as to saying what would come next because nobody knows that. But we are on alert. The president has put the military on alert all around the world. That's good. I guess we're going to have to stay on alert to some extent, be alert to possibilities because this is a dangerous groups that we're dealing with now.
Is the president going to have to stay out of Washington for 24 hours?
I don't know. I'll leave that up to him. He will be advised by the people who give him security warnings and so forth. But I think sooner or later the president will come to the Capitol. He should come to the Capitol and reassure the American people. But that will be up to him, Tom.
All right, Senator Richard Shelby, Vice Chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, thank you very much for being with us today. We'd like to be able to talk with you again if we can after that 4 o'clock briefing. I know you can't give away details, but if we can invite you back, Senator, we'd like to do that. Let's go to NBC's Campbell Brown now, who is covering the White House from outside the fence. Campbell?
Well, Tom, we don't know where the president is right now, and that is, of course, deliberate given the security concerns. They are going to great extremes to protect him at this moment. He started off the day in Florida, then flew to the Barksdale Air Force Base, which is in Louisiana, near Shreveport, North Louisiana. And it was there that he made a statement reacting to the attacks this morning. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense.
Now, Tom, we are told that the president took off from Barksdale Air Force Base for an unknown location. There are any number of places that he could have been taken. The most likely is a series of command centers that are set up across the country, all over the country, that are essentially communication centers where the president could speak with the military, where he could have access to the latest intelligence information. And the military officer who travels with the president at all times, this is the military officer who carries the nuclear codes, he also has a database with him of all of these communication centers around the country. All of them, or most of them rather, underground, where the president can both be protected and have that access, the most advanced electronics equipment that could give him access to his entire team, whoever he needed to talk to. Two in particular are worth noting here. One is Camp David. Underground at Camp David, there is a facility there, a special communication center, and of course Camp David is in Maryland along the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. There is another place in that same location, Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, near the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, again called Raven Rock. And Raven Rock is the alternate National Military Command Center or Communication Center. If the Pentagon is the primary place where military operations are conducted from, Raven Rock is the backup location. Now, these two are worth noting, and we have no confirmation that they are in any way related to the plane crash near Pittsburgh, but they are in the vicinity of that plane crash in Pittsburgh and possibly could have been targets. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Campbell Brown. As these stories begin to unfold throughout the day, we're still operating really on two planes. It is surrealistic, but at the same time, it is one of the darkest days in America as we realize that this country has been attacked in an act of terrorist war in the heart of the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., and also in New York City, and then a plane that was driven into the ground outside of Pittsburgh. We believe that that is the end of the attacks for now, but no one is sure because we don't know who is responsible. Let's go to NBC's Jim Miklashevsky, who was in the Pentagon when that plane was driven into the Pentagon today. He heard a small explosion. Don Rumsfeld wouldn't get out at first, but I gather he too has been taken to a secure location.
Actually, Tom, what Don Rumsfeld did, according to Pentagon officials, is he was in his office on the opposite side of the building from where you see where the plane impacted, and he ran to the area where the fire and the fireball was still engulfing much of the Pentagon. And according to Pentagon officials, he actually assisted in helping some of the injured leave the building before he then returned to his office and then went straight to the National Military Command Center, again on the opposite side of the Pentagon, to monitor events where he now remains. Tom, this airplane that ran into the Pentagon, it happened within the hour from the two planes that ran into the World Trade Center, but it took a full 4 hours before firefighters and rescue workers could actually contain the flames and fire inside, so it was safe enough for them to enter the building. And that was about an hour ago when we were told that rescue workers did enter parts of the building where you can see where the plane sliced through the Pentagon. Now, it was actually fortuitous that the plane hit in this area, if that can be described as fortunate at all. As you see, Tom, the plane sliced through the building. It came in at an angle, flipped over on its right side, and hit actually at about the first and second floors. The third, fourth, and fifth floors were still intact immediately after the blast, but then later collapsed upon themselves. But to the right of that devastated area, you see there's not much fire damage. That's because that part of the building had recently been renovated with reinforced blast walls to prevent a kind of bomb attack, not an airplane attack, of course, but to prevent a bomb attack, and reinforced firewalls on the inside after the bombing at Oklahoma City. When the remodeling of the Pentagon was begun, it was decided to do it with extra reinforcement after Oklahoma City. Now, this area to the left, where you see most of the fire damage, that area was due to be remodeled shortly. And fortunately, a large number of those offices had already been evacuated. Now, there are confirmed dead, many injured. We don't know the exact number yet. And as rescue workers dig through that rubble, certainly the death toll here is going to climb. But really, it could have probably been much worse had this area on the right not been reinforced and the area on the left not been abandoned, really, to permit the redevelopment or reconstruction work that was to go underway. Now, according to eyewitnesses, it was an American Airlines 757 that came sort of from the direction of National Airport, and it just cleared the highway, which is adjacent, the highway ramps, which is adjacent to the Pentagon. But then it came in, and as it approached the Pentagon, almost at ground level, did a very hard right turn and actually flipped on its side and then sliced into the Pentagon on the first and second floors we see there. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC Jim Miklashevsky. In both that flight and the first flight, the American Airlines flight that hit here in New York, had similar patterns. They were flying at very, very low altitude, 1,000 feet according to some New York witnesses. And Bob Kerr said earlier that over Lafayette Park, just outside the White House, they saw a plane go over at a very low altitude that was out of the normal flight pattern for Washington, D.C. So obviously this had been well thought out. That goes without saying. The question is, what happened in the cockpit? Did the terrorists take the controls and drive those planes into the World Trade Center as well as into the Pentagon? And where was that plane that went down in Pennsylvania headed? Why did it go down there? Well, these were all flights that were originally headed for California. We don't have the tapes, obviously. The black box may be able to tell us something. This is the second plane going that you can see entering from right to left there that hit the second Trade Center tower at the World Trade Center here in New York, causing that enormous fireball. That is the first tower to go down. It was hit a little bit lower. It went down first, and the second one went down as well. So there are so many unanswered questions here. All across America, we know that people are watching with horror and with a great deal of apprehension. There are lessons to be learned from past experiences. Oklahoma City comes immediately to mind. Assistant Fire Chief was John Hanson, who became a very familiar figure and a friend to a lot of us, who's been through all of this. He's now retired from the department in Oklahoma City. John, first of all, this whole business of getting people out of the rubble in New York City and in the Pentagon, but the larger lessons about what we should learn about how we move on from here. What did you learn in Oklahoma City?
You know, Tom, that we can in fact do that. We were, stung, we were wounded, but we're not going to be defeated, and we won't in this one. You've heard the President, Mayor Giuliani, the Governor of New York, all make the comments that we're going to stick together and get through this. We've got to be patient. We've got an incredible rescue effort that's going to take possibly months. You know, our rescue effort in Oklahoma City took 17 days. This, with the widespread destruction, will probably go into the months. We've just got to be patient and pull together and and just take this head on.
There's so much that we learn from Oklahoma City as well in terms of rescue organization and rescue techniques.
You know, Tom, we had a team from the great state of New York in Oklahoma City. After Oklahoma City, the nation's fire service, FEMA, we all got together, reevaluated what we were doing. The New York City Fire Department is as prepared as any department in the country to handle this. With the support of FEMA and the rest of us around the country, we're going to help those great men and women get through this, just as they helped us back in 1995.
John, tell me, just from a personal point of view, where were you when you heard what had happened today, and what was your first reaction?
Tom, I was at home, and I heard about the devastation during the Today Show, watching Katie and Matt. And it just felt like I'd been gut punched, as the rest of the country. I stopped for a moment, looked at the video that we saw on the Today Show, and just really couldn't believe it at a point. And then reflected on Oklahoma City and knew that we all had to go to work, band together, and help each other get through this, and we will. That's the beauty about America. We'll pull together and we'll get through this and send a message to the cowards who perpetrated this great crime against our nation.
Thanks so much. John Hanson from Oklahoma City, who went through his own trial by fire and shares with us today some of the lessons after the Murrah Federal Building was bombed and he became such a familiar and reassuring figure to so many of us. We have some information that I can bring you up to date on now. The mayor here in New York said that 1,500 people have been brought to the Liberty State Park area, that is in the lower end of Manhattan, for those of you who come here from time to time, not too far from where the ferries go back and forth to Staten Island and over to the Statue of Liberty. 600 have been brought to the New York City area hospitals. 150 of those are in critical condition. New Jersey hospitals have not yet reported in. It's fair to say that that's about 2,100 altogether. Those are the people who have been recovered. We can only guess at how many hundreds more are trapped in the rubble on the ground or in what is left of the buildings. 30 patients, this is in the Washington, D.C. area, 30 people have been brought to Arlington to the hospital at the VA Center in Arlington. 13 have been admitted, 8 are in intensive care, 4 are on ventilators. They have discharged 6 patients so far. There are a variety of injuries, blast injuries and smoke inhalation, which is always a huge problem. Burns, fractures, several patients are critically ill, perhaps 8 altogether. There have been no fatalities brought to that hospital, the VA Center in Arlington, although earlier the Pentagon did say that there were people who were killed in the attack on the Pentagon. St. Mary's Hospital in Hoboken, back to New York again, 450 people have been brought at the Hoboken PATH station, triage center. PATH is a train that goes underneath the river over to New Jersey, and so they were treating him right there at the triage center. Mostly minor injuries. Of those injuries are cuts, bruises, burns, broken bones, and so on. So that's a quick update on what is going on at LAX, which is closed down, as are all airports across America. NBC Shelley Smith reports authorities may soon detonate a suspicious device found at the airport. On a day like this, there are any number of suspicious devices and calls that are made by demented people claiming that there's a bomb on board a plane or a bus or in a school somewhere. We're trying to track those down. There have been no other incidents so far as we know across America beside those that we have been witness to here at the World Trade Center, at the Pentagon, and of course that plane that went into the ground outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. NBC's Robert Hager. Robert, what's the latest there at the FAA?
Tom, you were mentioning about imagining what could have gone on in the cockpits, and really there are 2 basic scenarios in a hijacking. Either you have the hijacker standing there with a gun at the pilot's head or an explosive device of some kind ordering the pilot to make the maneuvers on the plane, or you have the hijacker actually taking over from the pilot and operating the controls of the plane himself. Now this is all speculative, but just an opinion here. I think to hit a precise target like the World Trade Center there and hit it right on the mark, that in this case you'd have to have the hijacker at the actual controls of the plane, because it's hard for me to imagine how you would force a pilot, even gun at his head or anything else, at the last moment. A single jerk of the plane's equipment could manage to miss the tower of the World Trade Center, perhaps go into the river, or imagine the Pentagon. You could go into a parking lot or an area right around there if you could jerk the yoke of the plane at the last moment. So I'm guessing that it's much more likely that the hijackers somehow disabled the crew and took over the control of these planes. But we may know eventually, because presumably the cockpit voice recorder has survived on each of these 4 airplanes, and the cockpit voice recorder would give you the actual conversation in the cockpit. And sometimes you can't precisely reconstruct what went on from what's being said back and forth, but the cockpit voice recorders of those 4 planes should give you at least everything that was said in the cockpits.
All right, thank you very much, NBC's Robert Hager. We're looking
Tom,
now.
there's one little bit of information just handed to me. We were talking about how many planes are still in the air. We said all the domestic planes had landed, and we now hear that there are 10 to 12 international flights, all of them bound into the West Coast, so presumably they were on the long Pacific run, or else the even longer Europe to the West Coast run. The 10 to 12 international flights still in the air. That's the last of it. All the domestic flights, as we'd said before, have landed.
All right, thanks, NBC's Robert Hager. We're going to go right now to, here's an update. The NBC affiliate in Omaha, Nebraska says that Air Force One has landed at Offutt Air Force Base, which is the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command. It's just south and east of Omaha. That is a place that the president very likely would go. It could not be more secure. They have a long landing pattern there and clear area all around them. And of course, they've got one of the most secure bunkers anywhere in the world. It was the critical part of our Cold War strategy. The Strategic Air Command bunker, as I recall, having been down there, it's about 6 stories beneath the ground, and it is heavily reinforced.
Good afternoon. I'm Susie Ann Jehan, the TV8 Newsroom. We're breaking away from network just for a few moments to show you how the effect of the attack on America is being felt here in West Michigan. Government buildings all across the country have been on alert today, including those here in West Michigan. City leaders have also been meeting. News 8's Joe Lafergie joins us live from downtown Grand Rapids with more on what the city's doing. Joe.
Susie's here at City Hall. Officials have been meeting throughout the day, assessing the situation. They've been meeting with county and state officials. They've also brought the FBI in. They are at what they are calling a measured response to all of this. As I said, they have been meeting with the FBI. There is no indication, according to city officials, that any facilities in this area are the target of any kind of terrorist attack. There is no alert here other than the same alert that's going on across the country. Again, a measured response. There has been additional security added at different facilities throughout the city. I asked Police Chief Harry Dolan what those security measures are. He would not go into details. Obviously, they want to keep some of this to themselves because of the nature of the security. Everything is open in the city and as well as the county. All those buildings, except for, of course, for the Gerald R. Ford International Airport, that being a county building, but all the rest of the buildings are opening and functioning. Government is going on as scheduled here, and that includes that primary race in the first ward. I asked Mayor John Logie, what's the best thing that city residents can do in this time of disaster?
And I want to encourage all the people who are here today and or pick up reports of this, that I believe tomorrow morning people should get up and go to work, people should get up and go to school, people should do those things that they would normally do. I think that's the best response here in the heartland that we can make to a tragedy of this nature while carrying our concern for all of those that are directly involved.
Of course, here and across the country, people have been gathering to pray throughout the day. There are a couple of prayer services we want to tell you about. One of them sponsored by the city of Grand Rapids. That is scheduled for Martin Luther King Park tonight at 6 o'clock. Another prayer visual, this one sponsored by Grace, set for St. Andrew's Cathedral at 8 o'clock. One more note from City Hall here. City Manager Kurt Kimball asking people to refrain from calling the city's 911 lines. Of course, they've just moved into the brand new communications center in the soon-to-be-open police headquarters. Everything is working there fine, but as oftentimes when disaster strikes anywhere in the country, there is a heightened fear among residents, and they tend to pick up and call 911 more often than they should, and they are seeing that here at the City Communications Center. They're asking people, unless you have an emergency, please do not call 911. Of course, you can look in your phone book and find the regular business line for the police department, and they can take care of your problems as well. But please stay off those 911 lines unless you have an emergency. We'll have more from City Hall later throughout the day. We're live. Joe LaFurgey, News 8.
All right, Joe, thanks for that live report. News of the terrorist attacks on America today led the Grand Rapids Press to print an extra edition of the paper this afternoon.
Extra!
That extra newspaper is available only in certain locations. Let me tell you real quick in case you want a copy of it. Outside the Grand Rapids Press building, in the boxes right outside the building on Monroe Avenue downtown. Also at 4 Myers locations, at Knapp's Corner, Cascade, Plainfield, and the Alpine Myers store. We also want to remind you, too, this happens to be primary day. People are going out and voting here in West Michigan. Also in New York, it's primary day. The Secretary of State of Michigan wants everyone to plan on voting. Candace Miller released this statement today saying today's cowardly attacks against symbols of our freedom will not stop our democracy. She's urging all citizens who are eligible to vote in today's election to go out and do so. We will be back shortly. We're going to join NBC News now with the special report on the attack on America. As the magnitude of the devastation continues to unfold across our country, so does the outpouring of concern from West Michigan. Here is what you can do to help. The Grand Valley Blood Program asks that you come in over the next few days to keep up the blood supplies. The Red Cross is asking for monetary donations. International Aid is recruiting relief teams. The Salvation Army is also taking donations. 24-hour News 8 will continue to bring you more information on how you can help the victims and their families. Also log on to woodtv.com.
And federal, and essentially describing the quandary that they find themselves in, which is rather rare, certainly unique in the sense that we have seen the catastrophe repeatedly. We have seen through the morning 3 or 4 events which would qualify by anyone's description as catastrophes. It has now been probably a good 4 hours since the last one, but yet they still can't go in and begin a serious comprehensive rescue effort because they're worried about what might still be there, what danger might still lurk for the rescuers that have gone in. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Pat Dawson. This terrorist war that has been declared on America today in New York City and Washington, D.C., and psychologically across the country has had such an enormous effect already. It has all but immobilized the largest nation in the world politically. There's been a severe realignment of where people can go and do their jobs in the nation's capital. Dennis Hastert, the House Speaker, was whisked out of his office. The President of the United States, we believe right now, is at the Strategic Air Command headquarters outside of Omaha. We don't know where Vice President Cheney is, except we're told that he's in a secure location. Don Rumsfeld is back at his desk in a more secure location. Secretary of State Colin Powell is on his way back from Peru. Then you have the economic consequences. The largest financial market in the world was shut down today. People were in peril in that immediate vicinity. Businesses across America are doing no business, my guess is. Certainly in the largest cities, so many of them have been shut down. All flights have been grounded at this point, and all baseball games have been suspended. The Seattle Space Needle was shut down. Walt Disney World was evacuated. In California, Knott's Berry Farm was evacuated, and a lot of other theme parks. All national monuments have been evacuated today as well. This country is on hold in shock and horror, and probably the beginning of a great deal of anger and frustration as well. We're told that all planes now that were in the air have landed safely. The domestic flights, there are still some international flights that are yet to come here. We'll have to deal with our shock and grief in the days to come, and there will be a realignment of this country in so many ways, the forms of which we cannot say now, because we're going to have to work this out together, individually, and certainly from our political and our economic institutions. But certainly there will be a change in security and a loss of innocence, especially for young people who have never been through anything quite like this. The most devastating attack since Pearl Harbor, some people saying worse than Pearl Harbor at this time. Let's go to Virginia Chow of NBC News, who was down in the area. Virginia, what was it like?
Well, Tom, you've already heard the unbelievable stories of people who survived, who are much closer to ground zero at the World Trade Center area. I was about 20 blocks north of that, and I witnessed the second tower collapsing. And what I observed, and what was amazing to me, were the reactions of the people as they watched this unfold around them. You have to remember that these are people who were streaming away from that area, who just minutes before were near the building or perhaps even in the building. And as I headed on foot going toward the World Trade Center, this was this morning when there was one tower still remaining. The first one had already collapsed. I was about 20 blocks north of there. There were thousands of people literally streaming toward me on foot, trying to escape that area like refugees from a war zone. I was one of the lone people, other than emergency personnel, heading toward the area when we heard a rumble. People stopped, turned to look, and we watched in horror as the second tower came crashing down on itself. People screaming out, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh no." And immediately, very emotional, people crying in tears, realizing that there were hundreds, maybe thousands of people in and around that building who were going to be either badly hurt or killed. And I think that the emotional impact of this for people, even if they don't know anyone personally down there, has been devastating. Tom?
Thank you very much, Virginia Chow, who is one of the many NBC reporters who have gone beyond the call of duty today in the lower part of Manhattan. There is the scene. It was not a cruise missile. It was not a nuclear attack. It was a hijacked airliner used as a weapon directed at the World Trade Center. The Twin Towers both came down. We know that more than 100 people on the airliners were killed, and an untold number of people were killed or seriously wounded in and around that area. And as you look at these scenes from several hours after the planes hit the building and after the World Trade Center came down, you have some sense of the magnitude of the devastation. Jules Rennell is the manager of the World Trade Club at the World Trade Center. He, fortunately for him, was not there today. Mr. Rennell, how many people would be in the building, in your judgment, at 8:45 in the morning?
Probably somewhere around 20,000 people, Tom. A lot of the financial institutions like Cantor Fitzgerald and Morgan Stanley Dean Witter open early. So all those people would be in the building early, with the rest of the population coming in between 8:30 and 9:30.
Where were you when you heard about all this?
My son called me, and I came down and I turned on the television and saw the flames coming out of the building. And at that stage, recognized, the magnitude of what was happening. But in my wildest imagination, could never believe that those buildings could be destroyed. I mean, the Trade Center itself is like a small city. 35,000 people work there every day. Countless thousands of people visit the World Trade Center. The restaurant on top where I work, Windows on the World, is probably one of the most recognizable restaurants in the world. I just couldn't believe I was sitting here watching the buildings collapse. It was a nightmare.
How many people work in the World Trade Club itself?
We had about 40 people in Windows on the World in the club this morning. There were some kitchen crew in there. There were the accounting people, the banquet staff, some cleaning people, and they were prepping to open up for lunch at 12 o'clock in the greatest bar. We've been able to find some of the people through our network of telephones, but there are still a number of people that we have not, that we haven't been able to find yet. Even though, the communication systems after the first bomb